this a minute, but I'm gonna.
All right, you ready?
Yes.
All right. Oyez, oyez, oyez. I will call to order this Sierra Madre Planning Commission meeting of Thursday, February 6th. Can we have roll call?
Chair Hutt,
Here.
Vice Chair Dennison,
Here.
Commissioners Catalano, Dallas,
Here.
Desai,
Here.
Pevsner,
Here.
and Spears.
Present.
All right, next we move on to approval of the agenda, and seeing we have a number of people in the audience who are here for a certain item, I propose that we move that item, which is discussion item 1, the parking, first, and then we do the presentation afterwards, in case any of those people need to get home.
Move we accept the agenda with that change.
I'll second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Okay, motion carries unanimously. Next, move on to approval of minutes of January 16th meeting. Did anybody have any comments or corrections? Good to me.
Move we accept as presented.
I'll second.
We have a motion and a second. All in favor?
Aye. To
Okay.
abstain, I believe I was not present.
Okay, we have all in favor except for one abstention. And next, we will move on to community input. If there is anybody in the audience who would like to address the commission on anything that is not on the agenda tonight, please come forward.
Good evening, Commissioners. Tonight, I would like to welcome and introduce Dr. Selra Beck, professor of a local transportation class at Cal Poly Pomona, and her students who are attending tonight's Planning Commission meeting regarding the discussion on the commercial parking update. So a few weeks ago, Dr. Selra Beck joined Chair Hutt, Dr. John Lloyd, Director Vincent Gonzalez, and myself on a walking tour of the parking lots in the downtown. And on Monday, the students will be coming down to the downtown to do the same kind of tour, to visit and do a study of observation. And that will happen over the next few months, where they'll come independently and do their own observation and do a study to help improve our downtown. That is all.
Thank you. Great. Anybody else? Okay, then we'll move on to discussion. Oh, we have somebody? Oh.
Please
Come
come
on, you
down
have
to
to
the
come down. We have to get everything recorded.
I'm Sora Beck, a faculty in the Urban and Regional Planning Department at Cal Poly Pomona. I'm teaching local transportation planning course this spring semester, and I'm happy to serve this city through this opportunity to study downtown, especially around parking issues in Sierra Madre. And here we have students, around 22 students in the class, who will help gather information around parking inventory. So we're going to develop a parking inventory and also do a parking occupancy study and duration study. And also we'll look at access between parking lots and businesses to improve signage as well as access points as well.
Fabulous. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you, yeah.
All right. So with that discussion of parking, let's move on to the discussion item 1, which is discussion regarding amendments to Municipal Code Chapter 1736, Commercial Zone Off-Street Parking, and Chapter 1768, Parking. Do we have a staff presentation?
I don't have a staff presentation. We do have a staff report in the packet, but what I would like to do is just move forward with your memo and then start going through the changes.
Okay. I think that one thing we should keep in mind is that as we discuss this and when we get to our second discussion item, that this is a discussion, not a formal public hearing. And so we're not going to hold the formalities of the question time and then the deliberation time. We're just going to discuss items. And if anyone in the audience has anything to say as we're doing this, feel free to come on down and wave your hand, and somebody will let me know that you're there, because I'll probably miss it. So with that, let's go through, and we have a memo from the subcommittee and proposed revisions. And if you'll remember, I'm not remembering when we had our prior meeting, but we had a meeting where the full commission discussed the sort of goals for parking, especially with regard to the downtown, and basically trying to remove parking as a hurdle to businesses coming into town, and streamline the code and update it. So the parking subcommittee went and reviewed the code, recommended changes, and basically tried to implement that general concepts. Also, if you remember when we did the commercial code update, we introduced a number of different sort of ad hoc review concepts, and those items have been brought over to the parking code, where they make more sense now here. So that's sort of the general concept. If anybody has any general ideas or thoughts they want to discuss before we sort of launch into it, we can do that. Or we could just go
I did
straight through the memo. Yeah.
Oh, sorry, let's do the memo first. and then we-
No, I mean straight to, I think the memo just sort of tracks the code, so if there's anything sort of general, let's talk about that.
Sure. I thought, and I probably should have looked back at the minutes, but I thought that when we had had these conversations, that one of the ideas that we contemplated was sort of, for the most part, removing the parking requirements, with the idea that we have that huge parking lot right there in the center of downtown. There's 2 or 3 free parking lots on Baldwin. There's plenty of spots in front of all the storefronts on both sides of Sierra Madre Boulevard in that corner, all the way through the whole zone. It's literally lined with parking.
Mm-hmm.
And I wondered if we could get some insight from the subcommittee as to why was it we kind of went towards keeping parking regulations versus kind of the idea that we have a whole lot of parking available already.
Well, not everybody in the community has read the high cost of free parking, and so we have to manage community expectations as well. And when you go to other communities, say Pasadena or Monrovia, and you want to go to dinner, how far do you want to walk? Is pretty much the litmus test. And some of the things in Sierra Madre, we haven't done a good job of making more spaces available. And the one night of the week the one night of the year that I always reference is back to school night at all the schools, because for some reason, all the schools on Baldwin and and the elementary school all seem to have the same night for back to school night. And if you drive up and down the streets on that night, there is wall-to-wall parking from the boulevard all the way up to Grandview on both Auburn. And so there's capacity in the town for parking. You just have to walk 2 blocks. And if you did some more creative things with, slot parking as opposed to parallel parking, you could probably fit a few more. And even when we had the tea house that was going to open up, why can't they park around the corner on Auburn? So, I mean, I think we have capacity to park more. I think the community's expectations is that they want to park in front of, the pizza place and walk in and get their pizza, and so that's the push and pull. But I think that we can begin to move the city into being more comfortable. And I think when they go to other cities, I think they are more comfortable with walking farther in order to get to their destination. And I think we can do that here.
Yeah.
So we all get real frustrated when we don't have one of our 3 parking spots in front of the pizza place.
Right.
And then we'll all park as far as it takes to go spend more time at one of the other.
We'll drive around the block
We'll
3
drive around
times.
the block 3 times for that pizza place, but then I'll park on Lima to get down there for a longer dinner. So I understand that dichotomy. I guess I don't understand how regulating the number of spots, which are not delineated on a per address basis, helps. In other words, just because we say that the pizza place has room for 8 people to sit down, so it should have 2 cars in front of it, there's no guarantee that those 2 spots are going to be directly in front of it. That's not the way parking works.
Correct. And
That's
the
all
problem. And that's the problem we've had.
Well, and I think that's mostly true of how our downtown works, which is we have one big field of parking, and that sort of mimics our development pattern, which was a streetcar suburb, where you sort of have this compact downtown. New development could have, based on parking requirements, could have its own parking, and some other developments do have parking behind them. I think that as far as the idea of sort of reducing, streamlining, and making parking easier to deal with is sort of where we as a subcommittee went to. And I think if we as a a town want to go all the way to no commercial required parking, I think that's feasible, and it would be very easy to do from a drafting perspective. Because we've set it up so it would be easy to just take out one paragraph. But I didn't get the feeling from attending city council meetings and from all the general plan meetings that the town was ready for that yet. But I'm willing to be surprised too. And if that's the decision that the people that make the big bucks decide, then that's not going to give me a bunch of heartburn. And I think that what we've set up is a system that's sort of more incremental change than sort of revolutionary change. Hopefully that gets us either to where we want to go or at least along the way. So that's why we sort of didn't go all the way to cutting the parking out. We didn't feel like that was really the feedback we've heard from people in town and whatnot, that the town's really ready for that.
Okay.
I think one other thing you see is that, it's been over a year now since we amended the non-conforming ordinance to basically require no parking in any commercial space that's under 2,500 square feet. And that's still, people don't understand that and know about it. And I mean, one of the things we did here is cross-reference it. But I've talked to restaurateurs in town who said, I wish I could put more seats in, but I can't because I don't meet the parking. And I said, no, that's gone. Go buy the chairs. And they were shocked. And I sent them the code provision. So part of it too is just an educational thing of as we do make changes, letting everybody know that those things are out there, and hopefully we'll at some point come into the 21st century.
We
Probably
tried-
no time soon, but
We tried to look forward. I mean, there's shared ride pickup places and things like that. So we're trying to anticipate what's going to come in the future. But I think there is capacity in the town to park more. So the capacity is there. We haven't gotten to the point where, like Santa Monica, where you're parking on the sidewalk. So, and like John said, I'm sure that if we said that there was, free parking everywhere and, I think we would get a lot of pushback.
but in any event, yeah, I think if you read our current parking ordinance, you'll see it reads like a 1960s or 70s suburban shopping mall parking ordinance. It really doesn't fit the town. I mean, not only is it outdated, but it really talks about, there's these diagrams of these big parking fields, which, except for one public place, we don't have, and we're not going to build in town. So we certainly need to update it and make it work better. Where we come out on the actual numbers is something I'm happy to discuss. So if, you want to launch into it then?
Let's go.
Okay. The first two sections, 1768, 010, and 015, sort of deal with issues, the changes here deal with non-conforming, and these were already addressed in the non-conforming ordinance. And so these are sort of conforming revisions to refer to that section instead of separately deal with it here. 1768-020 is the main sort of one, and this is the required parking spaces. The first section, we talk about residential parking. And here, one of the issues we've had is that as we've updated the various residential codes, we have made clear that one bedrooms and studios only need one space. And so that was done in the R3 code and a couple other places. And so this just clarifies it, so that applies for the whole town.
Wait, this is just for residential?
A is residential,
Yeah, A.
yeah.
And so does that, the 3 or more bedrooms have to have 3 enclosed or covered spaces? Is that existing language from the code today?
The,
I think so, yeah.
yeah, the,
I thought we had it was much higher than that.
For 3 parking spaces, it's 5 bedrooms.
When did it change to 3?
well, what we tried to do here was to, and in my preference, and we tried to model the code on bedrooms, but I would prefer just to go to square footage in any event, because what's a bedroom versus a den? You know, we get into that argument.
Yeah.
It seems to me it would be better to do it that way. So, you know, that's something that's, we could revise if we want to, or we could go on bedrooms. And what we tried to do too is capture this issue that if it's less bedrooms, but they're calling it that, but it's square footage, I mean, my preference, I think, would be just to base it on residential square footage if people think that's okay.
Yeah, I mean, this is either it's a typo or what, but we were at 5 bedrooms. I
Mhm.
think the whole concept of using bedrooms to determine parking is just weird. I mean,
Right.
I just think it's odd. I mean, I think it definitely should be, you know, as the size of house gets larger, you know, square footage, then I think it's appropriate to scale the parking. But conceptually, I just, like this whole idea of garage requirement, just, like, I think we need to look at that as like we should be requiring less parking. And I know what the problem here is. The challenge here is if we don't require some level of on-site parking,
Mhm.
then it all gets shoved off-site.
Right.
But my opinion is in large parts of town, notwithstanding the canyon and other areas, that are off-street parking, that there's room, like we're, in a way, it's underparked, you know, like, at least I'll speak for our street. There's plenty of parking.
Curb parking.
And I personally would rather see neighbors' cars and like people who live parked there than just have empty, like, have, you know, there's like, I have no problem seeing cars parked on off-street because I know everyone whose cars it is.
Right.
And the whole idea of requiring garages, we don't park cars in garages, period. I mean, they're just glorified storage spaces. I mean, really, or with the presentation we'll get later, conversions to
ADUs,
and-
right.
No, if they're
JDUs.
JDUs,
Yeah.
if they're attached.
Right.
So, I'm not a big fan of requiring mandatory garages.
Mhm.
And so, however we do it, it kind of falls on that thing of, we should skew it towards lessening parking requirements, you know, and even on the residential side. And I would argue that's more important, or equally important as the commercial, in the sense of 85 to 90% of our town is residential structures, right? Our downtown is tiny, you know, so, and we've got parking fields and public parking, so we can deal with that, but large parts of the town are residential. So
Right.
how we deal with that parking is really important, because it affects, you know, 4,500 properties or
Right.
whatever it is, so.
I think that, I mean, just from where we as subcommittee were, is that we discussed the whole parking code in the context of commercial. And so we didn't feel like we had a charge to monkey with the residential. And it was our intent just to sort of restate in a clearer way, although absent the typo, you know, what the existing parking rules were for residential. And so we didn't try to evolve these at all. I mean, I think if there's, the commission feels that that's worthwhile, we can certainly do that. I mean, I personally would prefer to see them just based on square footage. I think that's far more implementable. And that it also, to the extent you want to have a sliding scale, it would be easier to sort of move it to reduce parking requirements a little bit.
I mean, I think we should, because we can all sit here and say, let's just punt that part because it's not important and we'll get back to it. But the next time we get back to parking, will be just like what we're doing now. I don't know when this cycle came to us from, I mean, how long the parking code's been the way it's been. So
95.
yeah, so
But I bet you that was just a rehash of the 70s.
yeah, so so I would say let's deal with it, and I think the square footage approach is better than the bedroom approach. I've always found that weird. I remember on this dais when we were discussing what level of bedroom should trigger what parking, and I just thought, and then we had to define what a bedroom is.
And today's library is tomorrow's bedroom.
Yeah,
Yeah,
so-
and
so I think
we've
that's all.
seen a number of those
Yeah.
dens and offices and studies, that you're like, oh, nice closet in your study there, right? And it's like, really, do we want to start intruding on people's internal layouts based on that? I don't
And I
think
mean,
so.
I think we should be able to also incorporate the concept of, like, we live in an amazing climate. Like, we should allow, not only, it doesn't have to be enclosed. Like, if you can get it on, you have a long driveway going to the back, and you can park your car, because that's where people park their cars. Like, very few percentage of people pull it into their garage that's empty and then pull out. Like, they're on the driveway ready to go, wherever they need to go. So I feel like, I mean, a lot of places are going to this sort of where they're allowing, it can be enclosed, it can be tandem, it can be carport, it can be, as long as it's on site, not on the street.
Right. Well,
That would be my one thing, is to make sure, I'm less concerned. I agree with you on the climbs. I disagree with you to a point, on lessening the amount of parking,
Yeah.
because I lived on Miramonte, and it is a tiny little street, and I have to drive across Grandview all the time. And when people are parked on the sides, you see people jogging like this to get through because of the tightness there. Because nobody's parking in their, few people are parking in their driveway than could. So I think it's kind of a little bit of perception of where
Well,
you've had that experience
yeah.
that might
Yeah.
guide where your decision's from. But so I totally agree on the square footage. Would want to hear a good case for lessening
Well,
square footage.
we wouldn't have to
Yeah.
lessen if we allowed more flexibility in the type of on-site parking, meaning like it doesn't, okay, you're building a 3,000 square foot house, or you have a 3,000 square foot house, you need 2.5 spaces, or whatever the calc comes out to, but it could be tandem, it can be
In line.
in line, I mean, like on the driveway, it can be in an enclosed garage if you have it, it can be in a covered carport, like,
I'm old enough to remember in this town where if you parked on the street, you had to have a permit or you got a ticket. And from that, my perception was that this was somehow a safety issue, or they swept the street at night because they wanted everybody off the curb. Well, we don't sweep the streets at night anymore. It's done during the day. And I'm not aware of that we spend a whole lot of manpower enforcing parking regulations. So why are we, I mean, what is our motivation for getting people off? Now, you say that they're on your street, it's dangerous. In parts of the Upper Canyon, yeah, I can't get a fire engine down some streets because everybody's parked. That I get. But if you were on Allegria, you could double park and I could get everybody through. So
it depends.
if I looked at it as, permission to pass as opposed to some, street sweeping or something else where I want to make sure that we don't have, strange people walking around in the middle of the night, then yeah, I don't need everybody in their driveway. And we have enough, I think we have enough curb space because the lots are the size that they are, that for a lot of people, they could get in. Now, once you get into an apartment house or, multis, yeah, I want a few more off the street because the curb is only so long for that lot. And I think people feel that they own the curb because we get a lot of complaints about, well, someone's parked in front of my house. Yes, they are. It's a public way. So, you know, I'm not as, I don't know, rabid about, okay, well, everybody has to be off the street. I think, and also with the new, you know, dwelling unit issues, we're gonna lose that battle in the future anyway. So, okay, you know, maybe measure the curb in front of the guy's house and say, well, there's room for 3 cars there. And you have 2 in the driveway. There you go.
It seems like street width is a problem. I mean, a concern. So instead of basing it in, you know, the number of cars you need to park on site on bedrooms, maybe it's, you know, if on the narrow streets, you have to require more of the parking on the site as opposed to a wider street where it doesn't make so much difference.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a possibility.
Yeah, there are some jurisdictions where they classify like substandard, standard, you know,
Mhm.
streets based on width, like 40, 50, 60, you know, whatever the width is. They don't go as far as using that to tabulate parking, because they just go off of a formula of like square footage. But that seems like it would help inform or tailor it more to certain areas. So like, you know, Miramonte, it's got to be a narrower street. I don't know what it is.
Well, and, you know, to your point, and this is the challenge that I'm having with codifying the whole thing, is that it's West Miramonte that's narrow. East Miramonte couldn't
Not
be
so
wider.
much.
Right.
So maybe that's more of an elegant solution where we're actually taking a calculation of, you know, curb to curb. over
Yeah,
the
I
street.
mean, maybe what we do is we have some sort of, you know, impact, like you're saying, impacted street, and we divide them up to the ones that are impacted, and there's a different ratio for ones that aren't.
Yeah.
I guess to me that sort of the threshold issue is that something we want to tackle now, or are we getting out over our skis a little bit? Because we really, I mean, this whole thing was sort of based on us updating the commercial code and the issues with commercial parking. And I just want to make sure we have a charge to do that before we start, you know, editing this all up and then have the city council say, what are you doing? So, you know, I guess, but on the other hand, I understand your point that if we don't, we're here, we're talking about it, if we don't deal with it, this might not get dealt with for another 10 years.
You know, I'd also like to hear from the police department
Yes.
about residential parking, especially at night, and downtown parking. I mean, why is it all those cars have to be gone from downtown at night? Do
And
they?
I would like to hear from the fire chief, because now that we have red flag notices, there are places where, you know, we change the parking based on weather conditions.
Right, and one of the issues about that is if you know, we're focusing on our zoning code because that's where we look at this. But if you look at our streets code and you said the red flag warning, they've already identified the streets that are subject to red flag. I mean, so that inventorying is already done. So it would be simple for us to just apply a different parking requirement for those streets as opposed to other streets. So maybe that's something that's worthwhile to do. But I think switching to square footage, well, I think makes a lot of sense. And we could see about for
I mean, even editing this, there's some issues. I mean, if we just did edit this and just limit it to that, that'd be a good first step.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, there's even like I would strike all the bedroom
You're right.
language, but then like in 2, we're requiring 2 enclosed or covered spaces for 1,000 or more square feet.
Mm-hmm.
And then when you get, then 3 is basically saying under 4,000, it's still 2. So is that like between
Well, that's just
1,000 and
because
4,000?
if you try to deal with all these, if you try to do square footage and bedrooms, the language gets convoluted.
So
But
2
if
and
we
3 are the
just do
same
square
thing.
thousand, if we go, it just goes square footage. We could say, you know, 1 space up to 1,000, 2 spaces for 1,000 to 4,000, if that's what we want to do, or 3,000, 3,500, 3 above. on single family.
And make them spaces as opposed to enclosed or covered.
Now, in the canyon, they don't require covered spaces. Everywhere else, all of the zoning requires covered, and R1 is enclosed in a garage. So, whether we want to tackle that, it's another issue. The other thing is if we remember that the enclosed garage space counts in your FAR. So if you're not going to require garages, people are going to build out to their max FAR
but
and then park in front.
Yeah. But that's a good point. Like, the exact point. Like, I would rather see personally, like, how many times have we seen a design for a house that comes up to us and we're dealing with the garage? Like, can you set that thing back? Can you, like, we
hide it?
we don't want to see garages. So we have all these rules where we're like deep in the door recess or set it 5 feet back from the primary facade, things like that, right? I personally would rather see more house than garage. So, like, to your point, that's what you're going to see. You're going to see more house and less garage if it's not an enclosed, if it's a carport or on the driveway. And I personally am okay with that. I'd rather see a bedroom or a den or a library or whatever rather than the 16-foot of garage, and so I would be okay with that. Knowing that's what's going to happen. I mean, that's obvious. That's what's going to.
Well, is the comment that you're making, though, that even if we only require spaces and parking, that the remnants of that would still be in the residential code? Was that kind of the point you were making?
Well, it's twofold. One is that it is in the parking. I mean, it is in the residential code. It calls for covered spaces. The other is that if you're not going to require enclosed spaces, and where now you say, okay, you can have a 3,500 square foot house, you're going to have a 3,500 square foot house plus 2 cars in front. And maybe that's what we have anyhow because nobody actually parks in their garage. But, then the question is, well, do you want to, instead of saying 3,500 square feet, do you want to say 3,100 square feet is the limit and you could park 2 cars in the front? I don't know.
Here,
I'm just, and I'm not even saying what the answer is. I'm just saying it starts to get into a lot of these issues.
well, I mean, on a personal level, I have issues because there are parts of town, I don't know if it's very wide, but there are areas where homes were built so long ago, and they're treasured houses that had maybe a 1-carriage garage
Right.
or no garage. Blow your mind, nothing. And so if someone came and said, well, I want to build a 1,100 square foot house, we're going to rebuild this house, it's 150-year-old, whatever. Oh, by the way, you're going to have to provide a 2-car garage, as part of your development plan that's or an enclosed parking for 2 vehicles.
Well, right now,
as
even for an
opposed to-
800-foot bungalow, you'd have to.
Yeah,
in
so
R1, so.
so this is better, but
Right.
point being, like, that seems like I'd rather they build more house and be able to get 2 cars on their driveway, or if they have an existing driveway with the garage in the back, park there, or carport or something where they're going to build an 1,100 square foot, that may be a bad example, but whatever, over 1,000 square foot house, but then they're going to need a 400 square foot garage to go with it. So it's like,
So maybe to not bite off more than we can chew in one session, if we make the code forward-looking enough that when we do revisit the residential, that we can update those requirements then without having to revisit the parking, might be the middle ground. In other words, if we leave it to parking spaces rather than enclosed parking in the parking, we're not changing any of the existing code per se, because it's still being governed on the residential side. And when we go and revisit that, we could do it then without having to come back here. Is that the middle ground?
Yeah, I'm fine with that. I think
okay with that.
we go to square footage measurements. We don't talk about covered or enclosed. And we leave that, as you said, to the underlying zoning. And then, we can deal with that when we get there. I think that works.
so what you're doing here is you're going to just go off of square footage. are we okay with leaving the thresholds the way they are, or does that need any?
I was wondering if we didn't want to be slightly elegant in our use of the 2,500 square foot threshold coming before the commission, so that it's, if you're going to be here anyway to get your design approved, apply for a CUP to only have 2 spots instead of the 3rd spot. So
Oh.
from 10,000 to 2499 would be 2 spots, and it would be 3 spots, 2,500 and above, because
That
would
limit
trigger.
is just for commercial. I mean, that's not, we don't
For
have, that-
residential,
we
yeah.
don't have that trigger for res.
What comes before?
Oh,
We do-
you
we
mean
do-
the 3,500?
Sorry, 3,500.
Okay,
I'm
yeah,
sorry.
no, I'm good with that. So we go 1,000 and 3,500.
Yeah, I'm sorry,
Yeah.
that's what I meant.
But when you're counting the 3,500, the square footage, it's exclusive of garage, right?
For this purpose, yeah,
purpose,
yeah,
it's House.
right.
So
That
if
should
you're-
be, that should be noted in the code.
So your habitable
here.
or your livable square footage is that number.
Right. Okay. Number 6 on the next page deals with the guest parking, and this is just, again, restating what's already, we've decided in our R3 code. So I didn't think there was a desire to amend that, because we did basically do away with guest parking for under 5, or actually with 4 or less. Number 7 is an issue about how much parking we want to require for affordable housing or below market rate housing. We bracketed this, but what we said is basically, because the thought was one of the issues, and again, we were focused on the commercial zone, was that our housing element requires us to allow SROs in the commercial zone. And that if you had an affordable SRO, you don't really need a parking space at all. So we just subtracted 1 from the parking that's required if it's affordable.
So is it modifying 6? Like if it's marked, you're talking about 7, right?
Yeah, I'm talking about 7. So it just basically says that if you have below market rate unit, you need 1 fewer parking space. But the other thing we could do is just say, you don't have to have any parking space. Because that was also, I mean, I think that was Joe's thought. And so that's why there's the both options here, because we wanted to bring that forward so we could have that discussion.
I mean, in the big concept, I am for reducing parking requirements. So like and having more habitable use of the land. So like if you can get a house or a single occupancy, whatever, and there's no parking requirement, that's the best, because now we've got people using it,
Housed.
not vehicles.
Right, but if you think of, beyond just SROs, if you think about affordable housing, there could be family affordable housing, which is even moderate.
Yeah.
So like the place that used to be the church, that used to be the Yak,
Yeah.
that's catty-cornered from the school, and it's now 3, is it 3 or 4 units?
3.
3, I mean, those are family units, right? And there's a parking requirement, and they park in the back. So on that, would we like to have a lower parking requirement or no parking requirement?
For family, I think with a family, you're gonna get a car.
Right, and the fact that we say there's no requirement doesn't mean there wouldn't be parking. I mean, they might provide that. The issue is, if we start going to let the market decide, we've sort of left the market behind if we're doing subsidized housing. So there's a question of whether you want to leave that to the market.
Yeah, that's true.
So, I don't know. I see the arguments for both, and
I don't think we would have, in an R3 zone, have a multifamily unit and not require some parking.
Yeah, the Highland Muse project has 1 parking space for each unit.
Yeah, that sounds,
and
That
it's
sounds
family
logical.
housing.
yeah. So
That
you want to
seems
do
reasonable.
1 fewer. I mean, the requirement there would be 2, and it's 1. So, and if it's an SRO and 1 is required, it'll go to 0. So I think 1 fewer seems to work. Yeah. Okay.
I guess my one question about the SRO being 1 less, it seems like that code may still be a bit in flux and subject to change over time. And so do we want to reference the SRO code to dictate?
Well, a market rate SRO would still require one unit, one parking space. It's just if it were a below market rate, an affordable,
Okay.
it's basically a studio apartment.
Okay.
So,
Okay.
and then number 9 is for group living. We just left that subject to a CUP because basically that's what we did for the Kensington. We just figured it out on the fly.
What did you do? Is 8 in harmony with whatever,
Yeah, 8, we just referenced the second unit ordinance because,
which then references the state?
yeah, because
Whatever.
it's, we don't get to decide that
Yeah,
anymore.
okay. I just want to make sure that it's pointing back to.
Right. B is the, is where we get to off-street parking for commercial or non-residential uses. So this would include, commercial, industrial, institutional, everything that's not residential. And basically what we did was we tried to just streamline it by taking all these ridiculous laundry list of uses of things that we would never have in town. Yeah.
All
It's
this.
sort of funny. And we just put it to 2 different standards. One is for the storefront areas, and one is for everything up above, behind, and elsewhere. And so we sort of took what the average is sort of on rough estimation, and then basically chopped it in half to get the number that we would want. And again, you know, if we think that number's too high, or if anyone thinks too
So
low.
what are the 2, like I see one is, it's 3 parking spaces
It's-
per 1,000
It's 3
square
per
feet
1,000 for
of prime
storefront,
storefront area.
and it's 1.5 for above and, so office,
And behind.
yeah.
And actively used outdoor areas, is that in the rear or on the street?
That would be any place on the property. So if it's in, the prime storefront area is 50-foot depth.
So 1 only applies to that,
Yep,
and everything else falls into 2.
yep.
And just so I can clarify on that, you're saying it's only the first 50 feet of depth that
Yep.
count towards the prime storefront count?
Yeah,
Yep.
Okay.
'cause that's the front, that's the one that you want to drive up to get your pizza.
Right.
Right.
Yeah,
And
I
that,
just
so
wanted to
that's,
make sure that we weren't
that's
saying
where you're
that
gonna
the-
have, you know, mostly your restaurants, you know, the stores that have high turnover, things like service commercial, like, you know, realtor's office or pure office, those aren't gonna have as much demand. And so those, we would put in the lower number.
And so for, as an example, Beantown,
Mm-hmm.
are you counting where they sit out front as part of that prime storefront area? That's the clarification I'm actually looking for.
Well, Beantown is, the storefront area would start from the property line, so that it wouldn't count, we don't count the sidewalk.
Okay, where they have tables and stuff, that
Right,
doesn't count.
but if they did, if you, to go back to the tea house, which sadly is no more.
It's coming back again.
Oh, fabulous.
As the same
If
group?
they had seating in the front area, that would count. But you'll look later on when we get to the exceptions, there's an ability to say, well, we've got enough for that. But generally, that would count.
Okay, so the windows back to the 50 feet back, wherever that ends.
No, it's
square
from the
footage.
property line back. So if your windows start at 10 feet back, it's only 40 feet of store depth.
Right.
Yeah.
Just, if you're on the half space, are you rounding up or down?
We don't specify, so you'd use regular math rules. 0.5 would round up.
You know, how do you make a 0.5? I mean, do you have to make space for that parking? That's what I'm getting at.
Yeah,
Oh,
you,
you go up to the-
if you were 1.6,
You have
you
two.
would have 2.
And 1.4, what if you're right at 1.5?
If you're right at 1.5, you'd have 2. And if you are 1.49, it would be 1.
Okay,
Coin flip.
all right.
If you were right at 1.5, you'd move your wall a tiny
That's right,
bit.
you put a partition in.
I vote for coin flip in the director's office.
Well, I'm just,
Oh.
because I remember.
As long
when
as
we
there's
did-
witnesses. Tails.
Um,
So, I mean, the idea again here is if you look at the redlining of all these long list of uses, a book bindery has to have its own, schedule and draying, whatever draying is. So that's the concept of trying to clear that up and make it cleaner.
So how did you come to the 3 per 1,000? Is that just kind of like looking at general standards?
Yeah, it was a rough estimation. I mean, part of the thing is that, that these numbers really are sort of crapshoots to begin with. You've got the engineer's manual that has sort of the cornfield numbers. But those, in a lot of ways, don't really apply here anyhow because we've got, because we're built out as a, streetcar suburb, and we've got a lot of park once kind of uses. That's a lot lower to begin with. And then you've got a lot of variability in actual stores versus a similar kind of store. Just one store is more popular than another. So, we tried to make rough justice and lower the number. Basically, figure out what sort of an average was and then lower it.
Because, I mean, you're in the range of what's pretty common. I mean, it's usually like 200, basically this is coming out to 1 per 333 square feet, right?
Right.
But it's usually 200 to 350 or somewhere, like for like business or, I mean, it varies for types of
Right.
uses, but I think where you're really helping is that's only counted over that. It's not over the whole building,
Right.
which is normally what's the case. You take that math and however big your leasable space is, that's the number you get. This is, you really ratcheted it down by only saying it counts over the first 50 feet.
Right, and that also is a big discount for restaurants.
Yeah.
Because restaurants are often, I mean, we count restaurants by tabletops and seats. In a lot of other jurisdictions, when they do it by square footage, it's more like 10 per 1,000. And then also, often gyms or medical office sometimes is, 5 or 6 per 1,000. So it's sort of more of a bonus, if you will, for those kind of uses. And certainly one of the things that we've talked about since the general plan update is encouraging more restaurant uses, because that's something we actually can attract. So this would serve quite a bit of an incentive
It also has to
restaurant.
do with intensity. I mean, there's some, like a karate studio, is a big square footage, but there are only 5 people in there because they need a room to, move around.
Yeah.
So while on square footage, it's huge, on the other hand, it doesn't generate the intensity that something else would,
Like a pizza shop.
like a pizza shop or something. So,
Right, and the flip side is a pizza shop is going to generate a lot of trips, but the office use is going to generate all-day parking.
Yeah.
For them. So, those things trade off. And the other thing is, if you have this sort of mixed-use development where you do parking, shared parking, where you can have an office use and a restaurant use that sort of, you can use the same parking. In a lot of ways, that's what we do downtown just generally, because we've got these different uses. And so one of the ideas of the second element, in having a lower standard for the non-storefront, was to encourage those office and service commercial. And that's one of the things we noted that the general plan calls for. Let me see if I can find that. Yeah, in general plan policy L 3.6 is encourage office and technology uses without displacing retail. And L 50.2 is in order to increase daytime demand for city retail, provide incentives for the location of service retail, office, and other commercial uses above and behind street-facing ground floor retail. And so that's part of a way to try to accommodate those uses and not cause them to have such a hit on the parking. And one of the things we did talk about at our prior full meeting was sort of having things that were maybe a few groups of uses, instead of having this laundry list of particular uses, having, say, maybe 4 or 5. And we toyed around with that for a while, but then we came to this thought that, it's easier if you sort of do it by area, and that also allows easier turnover of space, because you get the same parking requirement for that space. And so whatever comes into it, you're not going to have to change those rules around.
Did you look at all at how that would apply today? So like I keep coming back to the Beantown example, so that whole area, there's 14 parking spots there. So that would mean that we'd have to have how many square footage? I guess that's 14, if 1,000 square feet. All those restaurants are 50 feet deep, every single building.
Well, how
every
wide
single
are they?
storefront.
How wide are they? Because that's going to get you your area, right?
Right, but yeah, so that's what I'm wondering. Did we look at, are those 14 parking spots directly in front of that section enough to support that if every one of those were to turn over today?
No, that wouldn't.
No.
But keep in mind, this applies to really functionally to just new building, because we've already approved for the non-conforming in the reuse of existing spaces, that they're considered parked as long as they're under 2,500 square feet, and all those spots are. So they could turn over now, before we change this, and there would be no parking requirement.
So this is
there
strictly if
non-
something gets torn down and a new building goes in.
Or if they build a
if
new
there's
big,
an open space.
or
They
if
change
it's a building, a space more than 2,500 square feet. So I think like the Bank of the West is bigger than that. If they try to change Bank of the West or the Bank of America building, those are both bigger to a restaurant, say. Right now, those are big spaces. We would judge it by tables, which works out more or less to about 10 per 1,000. So they would need, on the order of 50 parking spaces, and they don't have anywhere near that. Under this, probably the depth is a little more than 50, so some of it would go under the lower, but they would need something more on the order of 15, which they actually do have. So I think it sort of functions somewhat like we have, but again, it wouldn't require, for smaller spaces that are turning over, we've already sort of dealt with that issue.
Okay, I'm a little confused. The Beantown example.
Mm-hmm.
The 14 spots we're talking about are in back?
In front, the diagonal
The
parking.
diagonal
In front.
parking, there's 14 diagonal parking spots.
So how do you determine which public space belongs to
No,
which?
just to be clear, I think I took Tom's comment to be just sort of a rough estimate of, is this functional? Not whether those would count, because under the parking requirements, those don't count.
Okay, they'd have to be in back.
They would have to be in back. And they, in
Okay.
fact, do have some in back.
Yeah, that
But
would
I think
allow
those
it.
are mostly for employees.
Okay, so yeah, so the required parking is on the property.
It's on the property or through shared use, which we'll get to later, but
Oh,
yeah.
okay.
It's off-street parking.
Off-street parking. Okay, great.
Where does it, the 2,500 number you're saying?
Mm-hmm.
Are you saying that this only applies to buildings 2,500 square feet or greater?
No, I'm saying that for existing spaces of 2,500 square feet or less,
Existing spaces, okay.
that we don't require more parking for a new business that comes in.
Okay.
In the past, we've had like parking studies, is there space? And so they hire some company that spends 12 hours walking up and down, counting the number of spaces and things like that. And it got to be more than we could get our head around.
Okay.
Because they always came back saying that it was okay.
Well, and then there's the other thing that, and we get into shared parking in the next section, that, sometimes we would require a parking study done by an engineer, which, costs like $5,000. And there was that one guy who had his dentist shop in his house, and he's like, I don't need a parking for my house and the owner's spot for the dentist, because that's me, and I'm just gonna walk. And I don't need to do a $5,000 study to figure that out. And I think we let him, but there you go. So moving on to shared parking, paragraph C is this section that allows for a review of an individual space project, sort of on an ad hoc with the approval of a minor conditional use permit. And this is the concept that we had in the update of the commercial code that we imported over to here. And these are, so number one is parking where you have mixed uses that have different times. 2 is shared parking arrangement. 3 is live work. 4 is sidewalk and outdoor dining, which is encouraged in the general plan. 5 is specialty retail and other things encouraged in the general plan. 6 is adaptive reuse of existing structures that have a historic significance, so they don't, tear down buildings to put in parking. 7 is something that if there's things like warehouses or storage buildings, those don't have anywhere near the parking requirement. And the second 7, which should be an 8, is just a catch-all. That's other unique situations. So that would be a situation. The basic concept here is we have these parking requirements, and if somehow it doesn't, do justice for an individual project, a applicant could get a reduced standard based on a review, a minor conditional use permit review.
For some sort of shared parking provision.
Right. And then item D is a reference to the non-conforming ordinance that talks about the reuse, and so that's why we have that cross-reference so people can find that. And then E is the concept of in-lieu parking, that if somebody wants to buy out of some of their parking, and this is really important, as I'm sure Manish can tell you, that if you're doing a project that requires 8 spaces, but the layout works perfectly for 7, that last space is just a killer to your project. And if you could buy out of that for a reasonable amount of money, it can really make a project a lot more viable. And so the concept here is we need to set this in lieu fee, and if you remember, we used to have one that was $2,000 a space, and we decided it was too cheap, so we cut the whole provision out and said we'll come back to it. That was 90s we did that. So
then they got refunded back to them.
So, but the hope here is that in places like Pasadena, when they do this, they build a parking garage. Here, we could use the money for better wayfinding signs, maybe a study to talk about more diagonal parking where we have places where we have wide roads that we could find parking. I mean, it doesn't need to be, and we're never going to get enough money that would be a parking structure or anything like that. And I know that when we had outreach in the general plan, we talked to people, and they associated in lieu fees with parking structures, because that's what happened in Pasadena. So we said we don't want any of that. And it was like we're not building a parking structure. There's just not going to be the money for that. So that's really sort of the guts of the thing when it comes to the requirements. And if we wanted to go to, if we wanted to just take out the non-residential requirements, we could go to B and lower that number even more, or take it out altogether.
What part? Oh, B. Oh.
B's the non-residential.
I think it's good.
If there's a feeling that the city is not ready to remove the parking, then the updates that we're contemplating here are significantly better than the code is today.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's what we settled on.
Yeah, I really think sort of the way this town works, incremental change is functionally a lot better, because people can handle it, and then if it works, they say, well, maybe we'll take another step, you know, instead of like, let's do this drastic thing, and then people freak out and then don't do anything. So, and as you can see from our code, there's been a lot of don't do anything.
I have a question. Is there any advantage to us differentiating between residential and non-residential parking requirements? So that in the future, when we have to go back and revisit, you know, how many parking spaces for a house, you know, because it sounds like, well, I don't know, I could be wrong, but it sounds like it may happen sooner more than later that we're going to have to re-examine residential community parking.
Eventually we will, but I would still like to keep I would like to differentiate between the two uses.
I think that's more standard.
Yeah.
I mean, so
Yeah.
it sort of upsets the apple cart a little less. The other thing we didn't do and that we could do is, you know, we've lumped all non-residential together. We could break out, you know, manufacturing separately or institutional uses separately. Typically on institutional uses, you'd do a master plan where you could get at those issues. And obviously things like churches are gonna have big parking demand on Sundays and not big parking demand unless they have a school otherwise. So, those are more appropriately dealt with sort of on an individual basis.
So here, what you were getting at with B, I just want to ask a dumb question. Like, does it make any sense, like B1? 'Cause I'm thinking through, like, we have a lot of small, and I know it applies only to the 50 feet back of storefront area, but let's say, for argument's sake, you had a 50 by 50. So basically, the whole building, like that's the depth of it,
Mhm.
you know. So it's 2,500 square feet, and you did that math, you would end up with 3, 6. You'd have to provide 7.5 or 8
Mhm.
spots.
Mm-hmm.
On those sort of small retail establishment or whatever business establishments, the building, and I'm thinking back to sort of that Beantown Pizza, Casa del Rey, that whole section. Would they automatically be pushed into some sort of shared parking thing, or would those sort of properties, if they were examples, be able to provide that in the back?
I think if you look at the, and we had this issue when we did the model for the commercial code. You'll remember
Yeah.
that we tried to do models that fit, and we found out we couldn't park any of them. So, but if you look at the tea house, which we talked about, it had just enough parking for the tea house itself, but no outdoor parking. And that was under the old rules, which were much higher. So I think under these rules, I haven't done the math, but I would guess that if you did the math on the tea house under these rules, it would amply supply, the parking that's there would amply meet these rules.
And just to add to Manisha's point,
Mm.
a typical 2,500 square foot, that's the majority of the businesses that we have in the downtown.
Yeah.
Yeah, under, that size or under, right.
But not necessarily all of its prime storefront,
Fair enough.
potentially, right?
Right.
So it's a 2,500 square foot rectangle, you know, it all depends on the shape, but only 1,500 maybe.
Well, right, and if you look at the tea house, for instance,
Worst case scenario is
the
if
tea house is 2 floors,
floors.
so half of it wouldn't count, at least, if not more. So that might lower it. But I think one of the things is, when we talk about entirely eliminating the parking, is if you look at Howie's site, Taylor's now, you know, there's been a lot of talk about that area redeveloping. Or what if the post office goes out, and the post office, that vacant lot next to it, and then that house next to it, and if you have a big development and you have no parking requirement, you know, are you gonna be happy with that? And I don't know if
I don't know if we're there yet.
Yeah, and I think on those, we're gonna want some parking. And my guess is if we had any kind of institutional use, and I don't mean institutional in the sense of church, I mean major out-of-town corporate kind of, they are gonna demand more parking than we are gonna require by this rule. And we saw that when there was talk of, what was the market that went down that was talking about going in there? I mean,
Fresh and easy.
Fresh and easy, yeah, they wanted way more parking than we would have required. So I think there is in some instances, we've gotten on a lot of these rules below where the market is gonna require. And so hopefully this will cease to be an impediment, but only prevent sort of, the bad developments that cause people to say, why did we do that? Let's go back to the old rules.
Yeah, I guess I got much more comfortable with it when you explained that this is not for existing buildings or changing tenants
new stuff.
between, this is,
Yeah.
you would have to trigger something pretty good size
Right.
to actually have this apply. And in that case, they can come apply for a variance
Right.
just as easy.
Mhm.
And if it fits, then do it.
Yeah.
So,
And,
yeah, I think,
like, for instance, Dr. Sammy's building was one of the recent newer buildings in town. And I don't remember how big that was, but there was quite a bit of parking required in the back. And none of that would be prime storefront under these rules.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say.
And so,
The house in front would be.
right, and so this is, and yeah, to me, I think that's appropriate, it's sort of more of an office use, and so the parking requirement would have been quite a bit reduced. And I know that the parking was an issue on that.
Yeah.
And we tried to get them to share parking for the church and stuff like that, but they,
Well, would that have worked
want-
in reverse, in the sense of, because of the layout of that structure, it was beyond the 50 feet, and B1 would have only applied to well, what is now the dentist, but
Right.
the house in front, and that back 2-story, 3-story thing would have had 1.5 per 1,000 square
Yeah,
feet.
right.
Would we have underparked that relative to what the need would have been? Like, would that have been like,
I mean, that's that's a
I guess
potential.
you never know, but
Yeah.
well, I guess what you're saying is,
like you probably want.
if you assume that building is 2,000 square feet, the back building, the,
It's more than that, yeah.
or 3 stories.
It's two.
No, it's just two. We
It's
don't do
two, but
3
the
stories.
parking's underneath.
Oh,
But
it's
yeah, go
3
ahead.
It's a 3-story building, dude.
fine, let's say that, I mean, and it's a medical office.
Yeah.
Assume that there's a doctor, a nurse or two, front office, billing, we just talked about the entire parking requirement right there,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Well, we would have required 3 spots. And
Yeah, if it was only 2,000 square
So
feet, you
not-
would have required, and you,
not everyone would have been.
so
Right.
only 3 spots. So
and
then,
that-
to your point, are we under parking
Yeah.
with this?
Well,
Yeah.
you're the guy who wanted to get rid of them altogether. So
I'm trying to make sure we don't have buyer's remorse on this, if we only change it every 15 years.
Well, I think
You'll never cover every instance.
you're never going to cover every instance, but one of the things to do is look at some of the spaces in town and think, would that make sense? And also think about the places that will develop.
Yeah.
Yeah, the tea house for one. There's some buildings just east of us here that could redevelop. It's possible we could have some one-story buildings that might add a second story or demo and build 2 new story. Would that kind of thing really change drastically the parking need in town? Probably not. I think that the thing that does that is if the Taylor site is
Yeah, that's-
is redeveloped in a big way, or the post office or something like that.
Yeah.
So I mean,
I think it's good. I think it's-
that's the sort of guts of it. Then moving on from there is these are the sort of design concepts, and again, a lot of this stuff was really built for a 1970s shopping center, and just as we did in the R3 code, where we tried to streamline and remove strict requirements for CMU walls with so many inch-high bricks. We tried to get the concepts in without the strict requirements, and also keeping in mind that these parking requirements apply really citywide, not just in one place. And so the parking lot for, Mary's Market doesn't need the same stuff that something in town does, in downtown, or some parking that you might have for a mixed-use thing over off of Lima. So I don't know if we want to go through each of these in detail, but basically, we tried to just streamline, get the basic concepts in.
The insertion at, D, joint use, that was struck.
What number are you at?
So it's two, what used to be D, there's just a typo, tandems in there. I don't think that's supposed to be.
Okay.
Tandem, yeah.
We can look at that, and it might be an artifact of the redlining, or it might just be a typo, so. And the other thing is, if you look on 1768 060D, these are encouraged elements, and we had a lot of discussion about like giving people credits for, these kind of concepts where you have car share services, electric parking, and we basically punted because we thought developing new rules from scratch was beyond what made sense for us to do. And so we sort of generically listed them as encouraged. Don't know if that's really going to help us much, but it is something that we specifically said people could take into account if they have to make a finding for lesser parking. And, that's something over time we can sort of develop and see if there's something we want to have more specific kind of credits for or anything.
I think we should kind of run through them only
Mhm.
because like looking at like B1, this is now it's switching to talking about single family and duplexes, so residential parking.
Mm-hmm.
But again, here it says in R1, 2, RH, required off-street parking shall be located only within garages or carports.
Right.
Otherwise complying with all closed with at least 3 sides and a roof. So like now it's describing, basically it's saying, like if earlier we're gonna go, it can be uncovered, tandem, carport, whatever, however you provide the spots based on the square footage. But here it's saying it has to be in an enclosed garage.
Right.
Now
Yeah, and that's
those
again,
are the kind of things like if we don't pick it up, now we're
right.
doing this.
And if we want to sort of just be silent on that here, we can certainly gut that stuff out.
What did we say we were gonna?
I think we said we were going to be silent in the parking code and leave it in
Commercial.
the zoning. In other words, in the parking code, we're not gonna say it needs to be covered, that,
We're not gonna say anything.
we're not gonna say anything.
This is just the requirement.
Yes.
Okay, so then this needs to be struck
Yep.
too then.
Yeah, we can take that out.
Although there you make a distinction, you're lumping single family and duplexes. I don't know if duplexes obviously are different than like 2 on a lot, but duplexes I would think would be multifamily, right? So are we making any distinction at that point? Do those go with apartment buildings versus like
Well, it would
houses?
go based on underlying code. I mean, really, this was not an attempt to write new requirements. It was just to take the existing stuff and sort of clean it up.
So
Because
then we
you can
should-
see it said for 1, 2, and multiple family dwellings.
Yes.
And the thing is that multifamily wasn't really defined, so.
Well, should we say just a residential dwelling units or something? Like, do we need to distinguish between Whether it's 1, 2, 3.
Well, the idea was that multifamily, you could have parking that's maybe, if you look down to the.
Yeah, it's different right there.
That it's within 500 feet, because you might have a parking, sort of like a, separate lot that has that, and whereas single family, it's usually right on the lot.
So I think this one is really about single family, right?
Yeah, I mean, and we can move the duplex down if you think that's better.
Probably.
I don't think there's a big distinction between a duplex and a house with an ADU, personally.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the other thing we could do is,
I mean, it's fine. I don't.
some of this, I think, is sort of, again, to me, it's even a little bit too much regulation, but we weren't trying to really change here as much as just sort of clean up. So if the full commission thinks it's better to just sort of not deal with that.
Well, I think what you're really in one trying to get at is in the residential sphere, there will be some requirement for on-site parking, right? So however that happens, that could be in the actual zone, but here it should basically stop at that point and just say, right? Isn't that basically what you're saying?
Yeah, I mean,
There's
basically,
required off-street parking and shall be
it's located on
Who cares
site.
how it's located? It just has to be on site,
Right.
and that's it.
But for multifamily,
And that's fine. The multi,
it could be within 500 feet.
yeah, that's fair.
Okay.
And just like, if you want more information, look to the specific zone for how you do it.
Right. And there's a provision that talks about that, if there's a conflict, you look to this code for the number, and you
Yeah.
look at the other code for how it's located, if it's enclosed and that kind of thing. And I think that is in, let's see where. Oh, yeah, the last section.
Two, it says zoning codes, right?
The last section?
In the last section is the relation to other zoning provisions, 1768-150.
Mm.
It says that they're to be read and interpreted together, but if there's an inconsistency, then regarding the number of spaces required, this code prevails, but if it's regarding provisions other than the number of spaces required, such as enclosure, lighting, landscaping, et cetera, the provisions of the underlying zone control.
Okay.
And I don't know if we had any other discussion on the, yeah.
I don't know if we're there yet, but, so then after this whole little section, it goes to, like, basically design of parking?
Mm-hmm.
And does that apply, well, I mean, that applies to parking in general, but,
That applies to parking in general, and that's why we try to take out some of the more specific stuff about the masonry walls, 6 feet in height,
Uh-huh.
which, on the property line, which you're not gonna do in a lot of places.
so this is if you choose to have a garage or whatever, then you would go here to see what the design requirements would be.
Yeah, and to the extent that they're not inconsistent with the underlying zoning.
Okay.
And if they are, then the underlying zoning would control. But this is really for an instance where you have, for instance, in the commercial code, I don't think we really get into the parking design so much, so this is really would function there.
Uh-huh.
In the R1, it's really gonna be the R1 ordinance.
Okay.
And then we also cut out these exhibits,
The examples.
these archaic examples.
Yeah.
We did keep this one, which was the backup one,
Yeah.
which seemed sort of actually still relevant. but we nuked all the other ones and figured that those are the kind of things that's best for the city engineer to keep and update,
Yeah.
not stick into code.
Also, because the size of parking spaces is changing.
Yeah.
And specific to the last exhibit you had on the dais, this sheet, which is referencing Exhibit D. This was part of a general cleanup in 2018,
Yeah.
and it was adopted by council, but has not been codified at this point.
D?
Specific to Exhibit D, which is the backup
Uh-huh.
exhibit, this kind of pairs up with that
Okay.
in a different section.
This was never in here.
No,
Yeah.
Oh, so you're saying we should incorporate this kind of concept?
Well, this language
Yeah.
would go
this
with
language was already adopted by council. It still does not appear in Muni Code online, so, which is a continual problem.
This is
So,
our lack of publishing issue again. Yeah.
that. I remember we talked about this. And we
Yeah.
settled on that 10-foot width, but it was,
so this would be a continuation from what's already here, and it would be adding V and W to the existing list under 17.68.080.
I see. Okay, well, we can incorporate this, that makes sense.
So I did have a couple of questions about
Yeah.
that section. So I was most concerned from a practical standpoint about the screening by some combination of walls, plantings, or earthworks.
Yeah.
I spend my days over here on the boulevard, and as I come up out of the parking area, there is a beautiful planter.
You
that
can't see over to,
shielded the 2-year-old that popped out in front of my car one night. Last week, my heart finally stopped racing from it, but that's something that I had great concern of when I was reading this. Because literally, the kid popped out of nowhere. Because
You
in an
didn't see
effort to beautify the front, we created a situation where it was hard to see him. So,
Right. Well, this is meant to cover surface parking, not driveways.
okay.
But we could certainly try to clarify that.
So maybe it would belong further on the driveway width section then, or maybe this is apples and oranges.
Well, I think what we can, make clear, we can try to make clear that the idea of the screening is for places where the cars park, not where they drive, and that the safety rules need to prevail.
that was our assumption when we were doing it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
well,
And then in Q, or former Q, or future Q, whatever it is, I can't tell, exits from large parking lots, it felt a little ambiguous.
Which one are you?
oh, Q.
Down to Q,
On 1768-80.
yeah, 1768-80 design. You had an insertion of the word large, and I didn't understand.
Exits from large parking lots shall be clearly posted with stop signs.
Oh, yeah, that is ambiguous, but the issue there is, you don't have a stop sign on your front driveway, right? So, I mean, I'm happy to, we can try to figure out what large should be. It just seemed inane that you would require a stop sign on every parking lot, when a parking lot includes, the parking lot on your house.
Sure.
So, at what point do we? And I would think there's some actual building code
Or
or
vehicle code.
vehicle code that covers this in far more specificity than our
Well, like,
zoning
do we
does.
have them
But I don't think
out of
there
the
are, like on Mariposa, I don't think there, when you drive out,
to
there's no stop sign there.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna ask. Do you?
But do you need one? It's implied.
Not until you hit somebody.
Yeah.
I mean, it's implied, it's like, you know.
Well, it's not implied, it's in the vehicle code, right? So I'm wondering if this is just
Is it?
extraneous because the vehicle code supersedes.
Is
You
it?
have to stop when you,
Yeah. Well, to me, you've got to stop. The question is whether you're going to require people to put a stop sign. And
right. So an example would be if they were to build the Montecito and Baldwin parking lot today, they would have to put a stop sign there? Is that what this code means? Because that's a
Yeah, I
parking area.
think so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And as you come out from Mariposa, out the back of the park, there should be stop signs at both of those.
That's a lot of stop signs.
Yeah, that's, I mean.
Yeah, and
stop
that's
sign
why I put
on-
large,
what's the
because
point?
I was trying to get them off of the small ones. But if you want to take them off of all, I'm fine with that too. It seems,
I'm trying to think of an example in town where we have a stop sign at an exit.
But I mean,
Well,
you
parking lot.
would stop naturally. I don't understand. Like,
Well, and if it's governed by vehicle code,
then why do we need it?
yeah, I
do
don't
we
think
need it?
Need it.
I
Okay.
don't think we need it, but I think if when I go to Home Depot and I'm exiting Home Depot, there's stop signs onto every street that I go out. But you're right, in Sierra Madre, nothing.
We don't have traffic lights either.
Yeah.
And we don't have traffic lights.
You
So I
know,
guess, yeah,
I mean, I'm fine with leaving in the
I'm not
language
sure it's
says
something that needs to happen.
appropriate entrance, exit, and directional signs shall be posted.
yeah, that's
Because
perfect.
that sort of includes stop signs where they're
Yep,
appropriate,
I
right?
agree.
And then we just leave it ambiguous as to what appropriate is.
Perfect.
Take
Strike
out the second sentence.
Yep, that's fine with me.
Now, do we have? Okay, this is. I don't know where it would be, but I just have this real practical, real life beef with. You know that project we approved that our beloved former commissioner, architect, that where the subway is, that whole building,
Mhm.
and they had an exit out to, is it
Mariposa on the
Mariposa,
back.
right?
Yep.
And the wall between them and the apartment building, I don't know if that wall is on their property or the next one, but that is the biggest death trap, like, because that wall,
can't
the
see.
driveway goes down, but the wall stays
Yeah.
at the same height, so it's about 7 feet up. You've got to pull your car basically, and Mariposa at that point is only like 20 feet. I don't know what it is, 25 feet. I can count on the number of times I pulled out and like, there's a car coming.
Yep,
Well,
yep.
and actually, the very next line of
And
the
so-
code, line R, says that you can't have any.
Walls
This
or
turns out to
obstructions.
handle what my concern was earlier. Yeah, literally the very next line from Q, R says you have to have 10 feet on either side.
Of no obstruction,
Yeah.
or it has to be below a certain height.
10 feet visible at a distance of not less than 10 feet to a person approaching such entrance.
Yeah, so
So that's that.
maybe that was just a glitch. That was
We were
something.
too worried about the building, but
Yeah.
I think that thing is just.
Yeah,
so
I know,
bad.
because I used to office right next to it, and it's frightening.
All right.
Okay, and then we're
Pre-existing.
done with that section. We want to move to
Yeah.
planting. We tried to generalize this up and put the water saving stuff. But a lot of this again is going to be more generated by the underlying zoning.
Yeah.
And in lighting, we put the dark sky concepts. Is 68130 is the parking lot permit, which I bet you this town has never processed even one. Temporary parking lots we didn't touch. And 1768150 is as we discussed before, the relationship to other zoning provisions. Good?
Good.
So it sounds like what we want to do then is change the residential parking to based on square footage, take out issues of covered or enclosed and leave those to underlying zoning. Couple of various nits and nats along the way. Clarify some of the safety stuff. Deal with this language that got lost along the way somewhere and stick it in, and we're good. Yeah?
I think you can remove the clarification of the safety stuff, because I found
Okay.
another code that had the 10-foot provision, so.
The only thing on that last sheet, if it's V, I think that
Yeah, the
diagram
numbers all
V.
change, and the diagram will be A.
Yeah, okay.
It should say C exhibit, whatever.
Yeah, yeah. Add in an update. Okay, good. Did that bore you all to death?
Yeah. They're riveted.
They didn't leave.
I think they're
I don't know if
required
they
not to. I would have left if I could. Does anyone in the audience want to comment on anything?
What happened?
Any ideas?
Ready to change your
Things
careers?
we,
Yeah, don't change your major.
okay, well, I think that, that's it for the discussion on that one. We will, the subcommittee will work on the notes and we'll bring it back. I think we're close enough to a point, subject to our discussion on the commercial code and how that interplays, about, to a public hearing.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you all for joining. I hope that was riveting for you. Next on our agenda, or do you want to have a break, or?
Do you want a break?
You can have a break. We're gonna be here till 11 anyway.
There is, yeah, we can take a break.
Yeah, why don't we take a 5-minute break?
Yes.
Okay, we'll come back into session and we will go to presentation number 1, the 2020 state legislative update. Do we have a staff report?
We have a presentation from legal counsel this evening, and we have a PowerPoint.
All right.
Would you like to present from here or from?
You can present from here.
Thank you for the opportunity, Commission. This is intended to be one in a series of legislative updates we provide. This one today is going to cover SB 330. This is part 1. It's going to be a 2-part presentation. The second part we'll cover at some other meeting. SB 330 is also known as the Housing Crisis Act of 2019. And in the findings, go to the in the findings, am I doing it wrong?
Just the,
Right.
Was this the Skinner bill?
I don't believe so.
Okay.
No, I don't think he's the author.
maybe the batteries have died. It was working earlier.
You have to manually do it?
I might have to manually do it.
We have to do it next meeting.
Yeah. Continued.
Jen, could you get some batteries for this?
I think I know where there are some. There's a bunch of remotes in the other room. There's steel. And there's
So it's changing.
Short.
I keep it.
Changed it here. Right. Actually, Jen? Yes. Can you do this again? It's not even ringing here.
Oh,
I'm gonna start
Oh.
again.
Very nice.
East Mariposa.
You do it.
Lake Sierra Madre.
Lake
All right. Oh, yeah.
That known as
You don't let that plan?
Thank you.
Flood the dam, put a lake around there with hillside buildings around it?
Awesome.
Slide. Ah, perfect.
All right.
Okay, so in the findings for this new law, the legislator notes a couple of points. So first, to note that the Governor Newsom signed this on October 9, 2019. It took effect January 1st, 2020. So the findings note that there's a housing deficit of about 2 million units as determined by HCD, the Department of Housing and Community Development. The housing units needed to maintain the median cost of housing is 880,000 units of production per year. We're currently averaging 80,000 units per year. So
You said 880,000?
is what we need to produce per year to maintain the median cost of housing.
It says 180. It says 180 there.
No, that's the need.
180,000 is what we need, and we're producing 80,000. So, in all likelihood, the housing crisis is going to get worse. The overall homeownership rate has fallen to its lowest rate since the 1940s. So, to address this crisis, the legislator, one of the bills adopted this past year was SB 330. It has really two elements. One are procedural elements, procedural amendments rather, to housing development project applications. That we'll talk about next time. Today we're talking about the substantive amendments to restrict local development standards and development and demolition of residences. So the Housing Crisis Act of 2019 applies to affected cities, cities which HCD determines are located within urbanized areas or urban clusters as designated by the US Census. Now, when I drafted this presentation, I looked up the statute. The statute said that HCD will make a determination by June 30, 2020. HCD made its determination last week, and Sierra Madre is an affected city. So we're on the list.
Yeah.
We're on their list.
I would expect.
We're in LA Metro. What do you-
Yeah. So SB 330 does not apply though to housing development projects within very high fire hazard severity zones. So it's half of our city.
Which is north of Grandview.
Right.
Okay.
So it does not apply to that entire zone. And it does not limit mitigation measures under CEQA. And that's the state trying to balance its environmental interests against its housing interests. So the law states, with respect to land where housing is an allowable use, an affected county or an affected city, like Sierra Madre, shall not enact a development policy, standard, or condition that would have any of the following effects. So the first one. There's a concept, it's not a concept really, it's codified. We refer to it as no net loss zoning. That's that first box above. It basically, no net loss zoning basically means that the city cannot reduce the general plan or zoning densities of residential parcels unless the city identifies other sites where it can proportionally increase densities.
And is that
That's
density-
existing law.
Is that measured by units per acre when they say density, or is that sort of like affect height and FAR as well?
No, it's units per acre.
Okay.
But the new one, which I'm referring to as no net loss intensity, does exactly that.
Oh.
The city cannot reduce the building intensity of residential parcels below that in effect on January 1st, 2018, unless the city identifies other sites where it can proportionally increase intensity. Intensity is so a less intense use includes reductions in height, density, or floor area ratio, new or increased open space or lot size requirements, or new or increased setback requirements, minimum frontage requirements, maximum lot coverage, basically everything.
Okay. So if you want to take it away in one place, you got to give it back in another.
Mm-hmm.
And
Correct.
is that sort of rough math? I mean, how much detail do you have to do to figure that out?
This is as much detail as they provide us.
Fabulous.
Yeah. Okay. Next. So existing law allows the city to adopt an urgency measure to protect public safety, health, and welfare by blocking approval of entitlements. As you all know, we had a water moratorium that was just lifted, but that law, we still under the law we can adopt moratoria. However, now the city cannot adopt a development policy, standard, or condition that would impose a moratorium on a housing development unless approved by HCD. So we need to make specific findings like public health or safety findings. We probably could have still had our water moratorium. When we adopted it, was it 3 years ago we adopted it? When did we adopt our water moratorium?
Longer than that. It was over 5 years ago, I believe.
So when we adopted it, we likely could have,
I don't remember exactly.
It was before I came.
Yeah.
HCD would have likely approved, I think, they probably likely would have approved the moratorium at that time because of the impacts on the groundwater. But if we do adopt a moratorium going forward, we have to make very strong findings. Next, objective design review standards. So currently, under current law, the city cannot disapprove an affordable housing project, keep in mind that's only affordable housing projects, due to design review standards unless it makes written findings. Now, this is going to apply to all housing projects, not just affordable housing projects. The city cannot impose or enforce design standards established after January 2020 that are not objective. The term objective is defined. It means one that involves no personal or subjective judgment by a public official and is uniformly verifiable by reference to an external and uniform benchmark or criterion, available and knowable by both the development applicant or proponent and the public official before submittal of an application. That's going forward.
Wow.
So why do we bother with public hearings?
Yeah, why do it, they don't need us. Except for north of Grandview.
It's more limiting. But again, this doesn't apply to commercial projects. This only applies to housing,
South of Grandview.
south of Grandview.
So we could still do this in Hillside area?
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. And of course, all commercial projects, industrial lots.
And projects with existing design guidelines such as Stonegate would still be applicable.
Right. But when they say, I understand city cannot impose, but, or enforce, that means the design standards that we already have, we can't.
As I understand it, it's established after January 2020. So new
They would
ones.
apply,
So it's just new ones.
yeah.
So the standards we have now, we can apply.
Correct, until the state changes that too.
Yeah. Well,
It's coming.
okay.
Restrictions on development standards. So
Sacramento.
now, I didn't even know some states. So apparently, some cities do this. I wasn't aware. We cannot adopt any provision that limits the number of entitlements, caps the number of housing units, or limits the population.
Yeah. A lot of cities have the growth management ordinance where you can only approve so many per year. Simi Valley used to do that.
I didn't even know you can limit a population of a city. I've never seen it done. Cap it at 35,000 and say that's the end of it. I'd be surprised. So though,
This is for the city, so caps the number of housing units in the city as a whole.
correct,
Oh, okay.
correct.
Can't do that.
And we don't have anything like that currently, any of these. Right. So with respect to demolitions, the city cannot approve a demolition of a residential dwelling unit unless the project creates at least as many residential dwelling units as demolished. Keep in mind, this only applies to a demolition having to do with a housing project. This isn't just demolitions in general. Only demolitions where there's a housing project at play. There are more stringent requirements for protected units, which include units that are subject to affordability covenants, ordinances, or laws, that are subject to local rent or price controls, or this last one that we haven't figured out how to implement yet, or those that are or were occupied by very low or low income households within the past 5 years.
So let me ask a question.
Yes.
On Sierra Madre Boulevard, there is now a vacant lot where there was a small little house on the
Mhm.
south side of the street.
Mhm.
And I would probably suggest that that was occupied by a low-income house because it was built when Sierra Madre was first, it was built probably in the 30s.
Mhm.
So are we saying that whoever gets to build a house on that lot has to then go back and show they can't tear down that little house because it's occupied by low-income people?
No, they can.
They can,
They
but they
can-
have to replace it with something like?
They have to replace it if it's an affordability issue. They have to also replace with affordable units.
So we
Wait,
have,
wait,
we have a lot of examples of our housing stock getting older and people living in it, well past, we have a lot of houses built in the 30s.
Yeah.
And they have, because of their age, have become more affordable because they're not modern. So are they locked into being affordable houses now and forever?
That's a good question. I didn't think about it in terms of, I thought about it in terms of a multi-family structure where something's being torn down. You had affordable units there, and you have to replace the affordable units. With a single-family home, I'd have to get back to you. I'd have to think about that some more. I'll have to look
I
into
think
that.
that is something we see in this town.
Yeah.
But that's gonna make,
Or is it something that has already been designated?
Yeah, that's, I was thinking that has
I
to
was
be
reading
previously
this as
designated.
Had been designated, it's not on, just because somebody
How would you
is a
know?
low
It just
income
says are
person.
occupied.
it's just.
By
a-
low
It
income
also
households.
says subject to affordability covenants. I'm looking at that as already in place. These are affordable units via covenant.
But
There's gonna be a lot of lawsuits.
I don't know.
I think that covenant requirement is separate from, let me look this up. Affordability.
So you remember the house we approved on Lima a little while ago? Which has got an apartment building
When did it become
To the
Lima? I
north.
always thought it was Lima, but go ahead.
covered
Is
this.
that near Lima?
It's at the cross street.
Didn't that one used to have like an old duplex or something on it that they demoed?
I think so.
so they wouldn't be able to do that now.
Well, I'm looking at this, the house that I'm thinking of was a little tiny house. I mean, if it was 1,000 square feet, I'd be amazed. And so it is by nature affordable housing. I mean, we have a lot of tiny little houses that are affordable.
Yeah, this doesn't make sense, though. I mean, I live in a crappy little house because I haven't
Live
been
in a
able to
very
fix
nice
it up
house.
yet. The back one's really terrible, built in 30. And I fixed up the front. And so if I went to rent it, it would be lower than normal market rate probably, because I haven't fixed it up yet. If it doesn't have to be a designated place, then I couldn't fix up my place because it would make it a higher rent place. I mean, it doesn't make sense. I think it
Yeah.
has to be related to,
Well, I think this
designated.
this has to do with demolition.
You're saying what would make sense. That doesn't mean law follows that. I mean, the problem is if it's really just people who occupy, that means you're going to have all sorts of redlining, and people are going to not want to rent to people who don't have good enough income because it might, subject them to future affordability requirements.
So I would
that
say
seems
this
very
really applies
self-defeating.
to, as it says, protected units, which
Yeah.
would be rent-controlled units, or those that have an affordability covenant.
So they're already pre-designated.
Yes, that's the way I read
So
it.
it won't limit the number, in other words, you won't diminish the number of affordable units in your municipality as designated
Designated,
affordable units.
Right. You can add more, or you can put back, you can demolish that building, but you're gonna have to say it's only 2 units, but you're gonna have to replace it with 2 units
Somewhere
and
else.
have an affordability covenant.
So is it the RENA numbers? So if we've designated a house as eligible for RENA,
Yeah.
that's where this applies.
Correct?
It says here, I'm reading it directly from the statute now. It says, because remember, this is part of the definition for what's a protected unit. A housing development project will include at least as many residential dwelling units as the greatest number of residential dwelling units that exist on the project site in the last 5 years. Oh wait, sorry. Residential dwelling units that are or were subject to any form of rent or price control through a public entity's valid exercise of its police powers within the past 5 years, so that's the second one. Residential dwelling units that are or were occupied by lower or very low income households within the past 5 years.
So it's the household income that is the tail that wags the dog.
That's one of the 3, there are 3 independent separate
Those are the
And this
criterion
is-
for determining what's a protected unit.
This applies to did you say development projects?
Housing.
Housing project, but is the definition on that any housing? Because a lot of times that is triggered at 5 or more.
Yes, it includes single-family homes. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, this includes single-family homes. But on that last point, this is why I like having discussions in groups, because you've raised something that I haven't thought of. So I will get back to you on this point at our next meeting. I'll report back.
Yeah, because we have a lot of little houses that been in the family for a long time, and they're set back on the lot.
Yeah.
They used to park in front, and they're coming to the end of their usable lifespan, and they're inhabited by people on fixed income. Not a
Mhm.
lot of them, but we have enough.
It's
Mhm.
gotta be designated.
How would you,
But they're
How would
already,
the enforcement happen?
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
There you go.
We,
That-
we couldn't figure that out. We couldn't figure that out either.
Okay.
But I hadn't thought about your single-family home example, so I'm gonna
Which
think-
is
I'm
what
gonna
we
discuss
see
that.
most of the time now.
but that also, would that also mean that if somebody was renting something to a family member or somebody, like a really low rent that would qualify as very low rent,
Yeah.
and then that family member dies or moves out of town, and the guy wants to raise the rent to a regular, is he already stuck now that he's already by de facto created a low-income rent because he's been doing a favor to a friend or a relative? Possibly?
But this only applies to demolition. of
This
it,
is a
right?
demolition.
Right.
So
Oh.
I don't think it would restrict changing that. And
Well, no, but so same example, I think. If you buy a house you know is a tear down, but you're not gonna tear it down for a year, and you put somebody in there for $500 a month because it's just $500, have you now triggered this?
I don't think it's based on the rent, it's based on the.
Household income.
Income.
So as long as you give a good deal to a rich person, you're fine. But if you help a poor person, you're screwing yourself.
Is that cash rich or is it profit?
It's based
All
on their
assets
income?
included.
So,
You have the turnover, you make.
you list, for reading numbers,
Fair
you
enough.
list addresses.
Yes.
So that puts those addresses in some kind of database for that. So if we tear down one of those if they tear down one of those, that changes that, and that could conceivably, somebody can say, well, what did you replace it with?
It would have to be affordable, replaced with affordable
What-
units.
Yeah, what affordable did we, because they want the RENA numbers to grow every year and not diminish.
I
Not
can
gonna
provide
produce
you
more housing.
really quick with the household incomes that would trigger that in LA County. That's of interest.
Okay.
$26,000 a year.
No, low is, 60%.
So
This says very low and low.
low is 58,000 or less. Very low is 36,000 or less.
For family of four, or? one
Uh,
person?
It's for an individual.
Oh, individual. So for family, it would be more.
Yeah. So this is an individual in LA County, because this is determined on a county by county
Right.
basis. And so I believe that's all I have for this one. I will get back to you about the question you raised about the house.
And it'll be interesting to find out enforcement. I mean, what triggers?
A lawyer.
Right.
Yeah, a lawyer
But also you have to also ask
Yeah,
yourself,
you.
who's going to
coming by.
who's going to who's going to seek enforcement?
Right.
Well, is it HCD? Do they have the right to enforce that?
Yeah,
Uh,
who actually has the right? It does the person living in the
CD.
house or the commission?
Well, I believe likely as far as the government goes, it's the AG that's going to enforce. It's going to be the Attorney General that's going to enforce it. But I think an individual can also bring a claim to prevent something that's contrary to this law. So there's a private right of action too,
So
likely,
there'd be
like a writ of mandate,
so it'd be tenant advocacy groups and whatnot.
perhaps.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's interesting.
The ACLU.
Wow.
Stone kicking down the door. Dr. Zhivago.
Okay.
Go watch Dr. Zhivago again. I told you. I just saw it again recently. It's good.
Collecting these.
We're done with that. I don't need that anymore. Here comes the fun.
We're not dismissed yet. I could go home.
Okay, we're ready to move on to discussion item number 2, which is discussion regarding amendments to Municipal Code Chapter 1736, the commercial zone. Do we have a staff presentation?
We have a brief PowerPoint presentation. So in March 2019, there was a presentation made to the City Council, and they provided the following policy directions, which was in reference, 1 through 6, it was in reference to what was initially proposed. And the council directive was not to amend the Montecito district with a commercial code at this time, not to establish distance requirements or impose primary and secondary storefront requirements, not to protect from overconcentration of certain uses or limit selective business use or occupation, but they did want to include the commercial parking as part of the update of the commercial code.
Well, can we go back to number 3? I don't remember any discussion of storefronts at the city council meeting. And that gets into here where we've talked about the storefront areas, and that seems to be out of left field to me.
I think that it was discussed, I believe, at the subcommittee meeting.
Not? that I remember. And we certainly didn't have any consensus on that, so that seems to be an item that's out of left field to me. And we can get to that more when we talk about it, but.
So the city council direction to staff and the planning commission was to level the playing field, not favoring one land use over another, let the free market determine land use, do not include limitations or additional requirements on business use or occupation, reduce parking requirements for restaurants and specialty shops, address more than square footage regulations, include requirements around CUPs for specific use types, and do not include Montecito District in the commercial code. Commercial code update objectives, as you can see, in response to council's direction, I have omitted a couple of the statements that are included in these bullet points. So the objectives are to maintain a vibrant commercial district, encourage small business retention and attraction, separate regulation of use from design, facilitate land use entitlement process for commercial establishments, and create a list of commercial use categories. We've seen this map a number of times. It's basically the commercial zone boundaries. The numbers are representing approximate block lengths. And as we discussed in the commercial parking code a bit, the majority of the businesses or the buildings within the downtown are fairly small. Of the 128 total buildings, 79 of those buildings are under 2,500 square feet, as represented in the bar chart. So the proposed revisions to facilitate the land use entitlement process is basically to establish procedures for staff review, ministerial review of smaller projects, discretionary review for larger projects. We're also proposing to add a new cosmetic services land use category and review process, and to establish procedures for design review of new commercial projects and tenant improvements as well. So this is a sampling of some of the use categories, is to eliminate a CUP requirement for specific land uses that are under 2,500 square feet. These would be allowed by right. Some of the categories, retail sales, office uses, and service establishments are shown here. Also, to eliminate the CUP for specific uses under 5,000 square feet. Again, these would be allowed by right. Financial institutions, educational facilities, and just as a point of example, the dancing, art, music, and similar training schools, as we saw with the Sierra Madre Dance Company that had to come before the Planning Commission with the CUP. This would be, if it's less than 5,000 square feet, would be allowed by right. Establish review procedures for environmentally sensitive uses. Here we're really focusing on those uses that could have the potential of use of chemicals that could be harmful. So laundromats, some cosmetic services, nail salons, tanning salons, personal aesthetics, which is also would be a new definition and category for that specific use. And also to establish administrative design review permit and design review permit requirements based on size. So if it's a new construction or tenant improvement and it's up to 2,500 square feet, it would be permitted as of right, unless that specific use required conditional use permit either by staff or planning commission. Same thing with new construction or tenant improvement, 2,501 square feet up to 5,000 square feet. It would require an administrative design review permit by staff unless specified by a CUP or CUP in the zoning code. And projects over 5,000 square feet will require a design review permit to be reviewed by the Planning Commission.
why would we want to do a design review permit over a tenant improvement? That's just internal.
They're typically internal. We could go ahead and discuss this. These are some of the ideas that we were throwing out
I
for
mean,
discussion.
obviously, new construction's a different beast, but, okay.
And that concludes my presentation. The recommendation is to accept the direction of the city council and subcommittee to make the changes to the commercial code. So what we have before you, I think it'd be a bit easier to focus our attention on the handouts that I provided on the dais, which is attachments A, B, C, D, and E. F, there's no companion to that. And the companion components of each of those sections would be attachment A, which was reviewed and forwarded recommendation to the city council back in 2018. And then the companion piece of that would be the attachment 1 in this case.
Okay, we want to have some general discussion before we launch into the nitty-gritty on each line? Or do we want to just dig in? Do you have any thoughts?
Some of this seems different than I recall from our subcommittee meeting, so trying to process a fair amount of it. The presentation that you gave, is that, I guess I'm just trying to understand where so is this your draft?
This
Who did
is
this?
the staff draft based on city council direction.
Okay, so staff draft based on city council direction of the version that was submitted from the planning commission last year,
In 2018.
2018,
Yep.
2 years ago.
Yeah,
Wow,
right.
2 years ago. Okay. So the planning commission had put together their recommendations, and then city council gave feedback to staff, and staff has updated the planning commission version based on that feedback.
That's correct. The feedback, actually, the draft code didn't go before city council. That was held back. And now we started coming back to that. We wanted to get policy direction from the city council. And that's where we had discussions, presentations to the city council. And at that point, the city council appointed a subcommittee. We convened one time, had difficulty scheduling, getting everybody to meet to go through additional materials. I was given direction to come up with a staff direction based on council's input.
Yeah, to me, the process seems a little befuddling, and I think it's instructive that the two subcommittee members are the ones who don't understand what's going on. Shows you that the subcommittee, this stuff didn't come from the subcommittee. And, you know, over a year and a half ago, we recommended revisions to the commercial code. And most of the general concepts that you talked about and are in the staff report are exactly what we said. In fact, a lot of the staff report is verbatim from the subcommittee memo.
And many of the changes that you can see in the packet that was originally sent, those items that are in underlined strikeout in black were not changed, which is the majority of the ordinance that the commission drafted back in 20.
Right, and you know, the issue is we've got this version that has strikeout in different colors. It shows some of the changes we made, but not others. it's hard to understand. And then, you know, when we put forward that ordinance, instead of the ordinance going to the city council and the city council reviewing it and saying, you know, we like the general concept, but we want you to work on A, B, and C, we were told that we needed to have a general policy discussion, even though we just spent, I don't know how many years updating the general plan, where we had specific town hall meetings about the downtown in Montecito, and we had all that sort of general plan concept stuff in there, and we were just implementing that. And I didn't hear any of the specific changes that are in here that I've seen that I can parse out in that general discussion or in the subcommittee. And so I'm a little, again, I'm befuddled about where these changes are coming from. And I hear, well, this is city council direction, but it's not city council direction at a public meeting. So how are we getting this direction? And then we've got a red line that shows, so the red is the new, the black is the old, but there's nothing that shows where there was a deletion from what we did. And so there's parts that it's really hard to tell what's going on, and there's not a clear discussion of the changes. I mean, the discussion is based on the general concept, which I agree, and I think we are all on board with. And then that's what I heard at the city council. That's what we heard in the subcommittee. That's what we all talked about. But what I don't have is specific things that say, you know, this doesn't work from what you guys did, and so we changed it like this, and this is why. And that seems to me what we need in order to evaluate these changes, not sort of more of the same general stuff. And so, you know, we can go through, but again, it just seems like this process is not the way it's supposed to work, and it's lacking in transparency. And the reason the general plan update worked is because we went slow, we were transparent about everything, we had community input and consensus building, and there were compromises. I don't think anyone said they agreed with all of it, and some of us lost some points, you know, but that's the nature of that beast. And so, I don't know.
I mean, my concern is just cursory that you guys are concerned, meaning it's kind of a head scratcher that you're not. It seems as if some of this happened and you guys weren't part of it. So if you guys are scratching your heads, like, we're one more level outside of that as far as this review. So that's concerning, you know, and I don't know.
And that's not to say that these changes or any changes aren't warranted or aren't a good idea. And it's just like, you know, when we reviewed the parking stuff, you pointed out certain things. This is always a process where people make mistakes, there's typos, other people come up with better ideas, and that's perfectly fine. It's just like, we're not talking about those, we're talking about the general concepts. And so, you know, for instance, on the first page, there's this cosmetic services. And so I guess the idea here is we want to sort of separately regulate that. But that concept is inconsistent with the idea that we're going to let the market just do what it says, which is one of the main policy directions. And it's inconsistent with the concept where we were going to move the whole idea of listing individual uses in the code to the director's list. So why are we singling out these uses in here when we could just put that on the director's list? And if we feel like, you know, the idea was, everyone says, we have too many nail salons. What are we going to do about the nail salons? Do we want to do distance? Do we want to have higher regulation? Well, no, let's just let the market regulate, because if we lower the hoops that the other businesses have to go through, maybe that'll even out. Or at least that's what we discussed, or what I think where people shook out on. But the concept of moving these particular uses out of the code and into the director's list allowed flexibility, so that if that doesn't work, we could maybe bump those up to a heightened level of review. And now we're putting it back into the code.
You're baking it in.
And it's like, well, ugh. So that seems, you know, a backward step to me. And I guess as we go through, we can look at each and every one. But I feel like I really feel like we're reviewing this stuff with our hands tied behind our back because we don't have a clear set of what the changes, the proposed changes are and why we want to do them. And every other code we've looked at, that's what we get.
Well, when we do revisions, we try to give it our best shot, and it's gone up to council, and we've been told, so if we revise this, is it a moot point, or is this what council wants?
Council hasn't, they sent it to the planning commission for review, discussion, and input. And if the commission makes changes, that's what I would move forward as a recommendation from the planning commission to the city council.
But council hasn't seen this.
They have not.
This has not come before the council. Nothing's come before the council. I mean, not even our code came before the council.
Yes,
They just had a
that's the
general
part that we're-
discussion.
That's the part that we're trying to reconcile. Not that any of it's wrong, to John's point, this could be this could all be fantastic recommendations that really pick up things that we missed in the nuanced version that we did previously. I think the disconnect for us is that we prepared a document for council never saw it, and now we're being told that council had direction on it. So how can council give us direction on a document they haven't seen?
Because it's council. Okay.
So I guess that's what I'm trying to understand is if they haven't seen it, but they're giving us feedback on it, but the one time that the subcommittee met, we didn't get any feedback on it, where is this feedback coming from?
And I guess the point of confusion is that they seem to single out these medical, cosmetic services as opposed to, of all the things in town, it was either left out. And I don't think we intentionally left it out. I think it was more generic, but, so that tells me that they had one flag to wave on this thing. So I don't know. I mean,
How would you two recommend we move? Can we move forward, or does this need to, because there's a subcommittee of y'all, and then there's a subcommittee with the council,
There
right?
was yes, and to be clear,
The
I am not on the subcommittee that did the drafting. I am on the subcommittee that was with the subcommittee.
Okay.
of
Yeah,
the-
and
of the council.
I
So-
think the concept of subcommittees are a useful idea to try to plow through drafting of stuff that is inefficient to do at an open public hearing. The problem with the joint subcommittee was that it involved a number of people. It was at City Hall during city hours, business hours. It was hard to get everyone together, and it just didn't happen.
Yeah.
And I don't think that's anybody's fault. It's just, it's hard to coordinate. Whereas, as you know, when we've done subcommittees, we met in off hours or on the weekend, and we could plow through this stuff. And I think and it was a smaller number of people because it's less than a quorum of the planning commission is fewer than less than a quorum of the planning commission plus less than a quorum of the city council plus staff, right? That's a bigger body to try to coordinate. So I don't know. I'm open to what people want to do. I do have a concern that if we make recommendations on this, we do it without knowing what we're really looking at. So, I mean, we're only at a discussion stage now, so I don't know if it hurts us to go through. But there are some things that I caught that I was like, wow, why is this in here? And I worry that they're ones that we are missing. So,
I guess, do we have a true red line that shows what it is that we sent last time and the changes that were made by staff against that?
okay.
So I guess, to me, it feels like that's the version that we don't have,
Right.
because I can't make,
Because if you look at the table, which is section 1736.020A, this is an entirely new table. So we don't know what's changed from our table. We don't have a red line from the director's list. And I did a cursory review and I saw a couple things that were changed, but not a whole bunch, so I don't really, but
Yeah,
I
it's
didn't,
basically the same.
I didn't look through it in detail.
And for the other table that you just referenced, that entire table was replaced. That's why there's not a red line. It would just be what you see over from yours to this new one.
Is the 2018 yours?
Yes.
That's what we approved, yeah.
this
The
is-
commission.
The
not-
commission-
Not the subcommittee.
This
the-
is
the
a
whole
brand.
commission.
Yeah, 'cause
not a
remember-
I don't want to say brand new, but this one does not have this struck out,
No, but
or it does.
well, the version, not these, but this version that was in the staff pack,
A.
like attachment 1,
Yeah.
so the black mark out is what the planning commission proposed to mark out, to delete. The black underlining is what the planning commission proposed to add. The red underlining is what's new to be added, and it's not clear to me if there's parts that were deleted from what we had proposed that have been deleted, because I don't see any strikeouts that match.
Why don't we
So,
ask staff, this is what the planning commission proposed plus the city
Yes,
council's
this
input?
was a version 8 from the planning commission that I received from John Hutt as a PDF document.
Okay.
And the only thing I did to this document was to add attachment A, and putting in from 2018 so we can see the two differences between the two documents.
And attachment 1 is the same as attachment A with input from the city council?
Yes,
So it shouldn't conflict with what we've already done?
it does if you're looking at, well, not for attachment 1. All we did was add 2 definitions. One regarding personal aesthetics. Another one was, the first one was cosmetic services. And that would be, should be it.
So this is essentially the work of the planning commission plus the input from the city council?
Right.
well, it's not city council,
It's
because the
staff.
city council never
City
saw
coun-
this.
The city council subcommittee.
No,
Now,
this
as-
never went to the
As
subcommittee.
directed by the city council subcommittee and asking staff to come back with revisions to the code that was proposed by the planning commission.
So it sounds like in lieu of the joint meeting
There
of
was-
subcommittees, staff did it.
Right.
Okay. I don't
See,
know what
there's
that
weird
means.
stuff like, okay, they added cosmetic services, like in the definition, which seems innocuous enough. But if the very concept of having another category of uses is DOA, then you wouldn't have that. Like, you know what I mean? Like, on the bigger level, if that whole idea of creating this other use group is bad, then you're not gonna have that.
That's
So
correct.
it's like, there's all these,
Yeah, so I guess if we're gonna start chewing through, why did staff think it would be a good idea to add these definitions if the whole point was to move the concepts to a separate director's list?
We wanted to be able, since we were creating a new use category in the director's list, we wanted to be able to define what that was.
well, are there use categories in the director's list, or is it just a list of
Yeah,
there-
but-
uses?
Yeah, there's use
There is-
categories,
there is,
so it's
like,
retail,
okay.
financial services.
Are all of the uses on the director's list defined in the definitions?
Not, probably not entirely, no. I would imagine not. And I think some of them would be more self-explanatory.
Yeah, so there's not a definition of retail. There's not a definition of, let me see if there's.
So then.
There's not a definition of financial services. So there's like, there's all these
That was the-
categories that aren't defined, and then, but for some reason, we felt the need to define these particular ones. So, I mean, if we're gonna say, let's define the categories, and then the director's list should just list those sort of particular sub-uses, then we need to define all the categories. And if we're not gonna do that, I don't understand why we're defining these two things here.
Retail wasn't in our, it wasn't in attachment A either. So that might be something we overlooked when we did it before.
Well, no, I think the way that we approached it was we weren't gonna define any of that in code, we were just gonna do it all in the director's list. But, I mean, I think it's reasonable to say we should give the director, flexibility on the sub things, but we're gonna define the categories, if that's the way we wanna do it. But if that's the case, then we need to define the categories, you know?
As I said, this is up for discussion. If we think this would be complicating matters further, we could simply omit these, and then we would omit it from the categories uses.
I mean, that's my preference. The other issue is, now that we've been tasked with doing the parking, there's some definitions that we use in the parking that we define just in the commercial code
That have been.
that we should probably take out of the commercial code and move to the general definition. So, just so that those could tie together.
Such as primary storefront.
Primary storefront, and did we move, below market rate unit here? I don't remember. Yeah, we did already.
So are we plowing through this by attachments, A and 1?
Yes.
Is that what you guys wanna do?
I don't know, yeah,
I mean, the rest of us are flying a little bit in the dark, so.
yeah, and
Well, I mean, I feel like I'm flying in the dark. That's.
Well,
So-
I mean, I think I have a better understanding
don't-
now, and thank you, staff, for explaining the nature of this. I don't necessarily understand how we got there, but I understand now what we're looking at, so thank you. I mean, we can start flipping pages and chewing on it, I guess. Or do you think that, well, I guess the different ways to proceed are to just start flipping pages and start chewing on it, or having a planning commission subcommittee
Well, I
take
don't.
a look at it?
I don't think we need a subcommittee. I mean, I think if there are particular revisions to what we proposed that staff, council, anybody thinks needs to get fixed, I just think that we should focus on those instead of the general concepts. So, I mean, I'd sort of like to understand, like on these cosmetics, we added these definitions because of blah. And then we can go, oh, okay. Instead of just saying, here's a definition, well, what's your recommendation? Well, my recommendation is, I don't know why we added it, so I would just delete it. But there might be a good reason, I'm just not hearing it. And I don't remember from either the subcommittee or the city council meeting where they discussed this, that this was a policy direction. So I'm sort of at a loss as to why people think it's a good idea to add this definition here and not any of the other sort of category definitions. And maybe it's because we think we should add categories and we just didn't realize that we didn't have the other ones. Okay, well then let's go fix it that way, if that's really what the direction is. It's also, you know, in some of the cases where we've done code amendments and we've had direction from council, direct direction from council at public hearings, it was really clear what they wanted, and we went and fixed it. And so here it's like, I don't know if the direction is go put the categories in the code and just give the director flexibility on the sub-uses, or it's, we just really don't want cosmetic services, or what?
Well, it goes back, initially you would think that the council sets policy and we figure out how to make the code and words fit the policy directive. And that's, but it seems like at this point, they've not just done policy, but they're making specific, decisions as to, oh no, you need to put this in here.
That was not the case for these two definitions, though.
Ah,
So that's why I was suggesting we put these in here as a way to regulate uses that we want to be able to have some control over.
But why do we need those, defined in code when we don't define all of the uses in the director's list? It doesn't
And
seem
we don't have to,
necessary.
And we don't have to do this.
Okay.
so would staff find this, would staff use this, and would it be useful for the public who you have to serve to have these definitions in place?
If we get questioned by somebody who wants to open up another
Type of business.
right, then it would be, sometimes it is useful.
But wouldn't it be useful just to give them the director's list with the full, complete, I mean, they're gonna get that list regardless, right?
So, I guess the more fundamental question was, if we look at the presentation, it seemed like there were some conflicting directives from council, right?
You mean this
Yeah.
PowerPoint?
Yeah, the PowerPoint.
Well, they told us to do things and not do other things. There were a lot of no's at the beginning, and there was only one yes.
Well,
Right, but I thought that
but
one
the
of the-
idea of like, let the market decide, but then regulate it seems sort of not consistent.
Yeah,
So,
and remove lists, but then there's a couple things that should be on a special list.
Yeah, so,
Those are ones I'm trying to reconcile, because I'm happy to take the direction and get the code written such that we can
we've only been working on it for,
Getting
4 years, yeah.
codify it, right? But I wanna make sure that we're being effective in our time, in our efforts. And so maybe the first step is to really understand which of those is the important one. And so if we can get a list back to staff to get better clarity on, that the rest will fall into place. Because I don't know how to eliminate
but how are you
lists
gonna do
and
that?
add
I
lists.
mean, the subcommittee hasn't, I don't think really functioned, so do you want another city council meeting where they go into this? I mean,
that's a good point, because we could sit here and go, like, if those 5 or 6 things were important key points that they want us to strive to hit, and we go and kind of do the opposite, like on a couple things, like number 3 is like a linchpin concept in parking and sort of how we set up the commercial.
yeah,
And so if that's like, they don't want that distinction, but we leave the distinction after parsing all this, and then we send it up, aren't we just asking for a ping pong battle, basically?
yeah,
Like,
maybe.
if that's super important.
Right, but the issue is, I'd never heard that discussed at the city council meeting or the subcommittee meetings, and that's something that it talks about in the general plan update. I mean, I quoted some of those things to you in the parking, about how we want to encourage office and service residential above and behind without displacing retail. Well, how do you do that other than separately regulating those two spaces?
Yeah.
And how do you provide incentives? We're not flush of cash, so we're not gonna be doling out money to companies to come here, so you lower parking requirements. I mean, it's like, so yeah, again, I'm at a loss as to.
There was also more baked into that concept. It wasn't just parking relief or encouraging certain business models to use that storefront. It was also based on, we didn't want certain uses occupying the prime visible storefront when other uses could use that and not basically blanket off.
Right. And it goes
So
into the issues of what we talked about, pedestrian-friendly walkability, and, we added a lot of those design concepts, but the way you get that interaction is by having active uses on the ground
Yes.
floor. And so if you have boring uses on the ground floor, if you have institutional or office or residential, you're not gonna have the same street level activity. And so again, that talks about separately regulating those. So I'm at a loss as to why we chucked the, prime storefront concept out. Because that seemed to me to follow directly from the directive that was given in the update of the general plan.
Yeah, so if we spend a bunch of time rejiggering this, but coming to our consensus, we may still be at odds with that 30,000 foot list.
If it gets sent up.
My assumption would be after this whole exercise, there's
Yeah,
only-
but-
We assumed that last time.
We've never recommended zoning code, which we were told to go do, and then have it not reach the city council, except for this time. And so it's sort of bewildering why this code didn't come before them in a public hearing so they could pick it apart and tell us what particular things they didn't like, or needed to be fixed, or were the wrong emphasis, or whatever.
That, and it was done by a subcommittee, so if it went back up tomorrow and was seen by different members of council, we could be looking at different
feedback.
directive and feedback.
Well, the other thing is a subcommittee, I think, subcommittee is useful to implement directive that's given by a bigger group. But subcommittee's not the place to develop policy. And so it's not an open public forum. And so when we have discussions about, well, this was talked about subcommittee, and then like, it's not my memory, is it your memory? Well, I don't know. Well, we can't go look at the tape. We can look at the tape from what happened at the open public hearing, if people have different recollections. And so if we want to, tweak code to meet the goals that were discussed, that's appropriate use of a subcommittee. I don't think the subcommittee is the right place to tell us what's the right policy vehicle.
Well, they did, your first slide did have policy directive. You had the no's and the yeses. Right. So, could we start there and just address the yes, and then send this back up and see what happens?
Probably not.
Okay. So we are being directed to address all the issues on the no's as well. And so,
See, but that right there is a problem.
well, but it's sort of, you have kids, why should I do this? Because I told you? I have a sense that we're kind of in that mode. We've been told you will do this. Oh, okay, so at some point, our complaints are our problem and not, and we need to work through them and then figure out how to make those yeses and nos happen.
Yeah, but some of those no's are fundamental to how we crafted this originally. And so it would be unwinding a ball of yarn, and make it straight, which,
Well, then there's some things that we might just skip, because the weakness on their side of the case is that it wasn't seen by the whole council. And you could send the same thing up on 2 separate days and get 2 separate pieces of information back. And I'd be willing to bet you, because of some changes, matter of fact, by the time this gets to the council again,
there'll be change.
it'll be a whole bunch of new guys. So we can just sit here and,
Oh, I
kill
hope
3
not.
months, and then send it back and,
It's not 3 months, it's November.
okay.
Because, right, we moved it to the general election, right? So, I've seen many attempts to revise zoning for downtown in East Montecito, whether they be specific plans or code revisions or whatever. And it seems like we as a town, we get involved in it, we start talking about it, we have all sorts of ideas, and then it sort of fizzles before we ever adopt anything. And it's sad to me that this is yet another attempt to do this that just seems like it's fizzled. It's sat there for over a year and a half since we approved it and recommended, and there's empty storefronts in town in, a very up market. So, and we continue to have, the uses that we all talk about, the uses that we said we wanted in the general plan, we continue to have those uses be disfavored by our code. And we still, as a city, have a reputation in the industry as being unfriendly to business. And the method that we're trying to fix it by is lacking in transparency and is bewildering. And just so I'm, I don't know where to go. It seems to me that maybe we can, maybe we could flip through some of this and give some general policy or concept or feedback. Do you think that's productive, or is it just a waste of time?
Well, I mean, I'm kind of in line with what Bob just said. I think we're, for lack of a better terminology, we're kind of being told this is, like, rewrite this, basically, to match that list. And I have some fundamental issues because we've spent a lot of time, like on item 3, baking that into what you just talked about. And so if we spend a lot of time here trying to make that straight, and I don't think we'll get there. I think for one, will have an issue with it. So if it goes back the same way it was baked here, I think it's just gonna either languish up there or they can change it. I don't know. Like,
Actually, I think we should give it our best shot and send it back, because I don't think they'll remember what they did from before. I don't.
Well, then why don't we just send up our old
that's
code?
that was my next thought, was why doesn't this just, the plan was this would
Because we're on
land
television
here.
and someone's watching and they'll say, hey, we have an obligation to give it our best shot, but I'm not sure that without specific policy directive from the council as a whole, we can fulfill all their obligations. But I think, okay, you want us to work on that, we'll work on it, but I don't think we should get emotionally attached to our.
Well, and the other thing is, let's be clear that it doesn't matter how much time we put into something if that's not the right way to do it. It should be thrown out, right? And so I don't want to stick to something just because we did it, right? That's not the point. The point is we should do what's right, what's best for the town, what follows the general plan and the policy directions presented by the city council. So it just doesn't seem to me that what we're getting is consistent with any of that. And it's like the number 3, I didn't hear that at any of those meetings. And it seems contrary to the general plan. And so if we unwind all of that concept and then we send it up to the city council, and then the city council is like, yeah, why'd you do this? Then we're going to be like, oh,
Well, but to back up on what you started to say was, I think you're shortchanging, the effort that went into, like, and I'm going to hone in on that number 3, to develop that concept into something that's strung across the parking, that's strung across sort of the general plan, that's strung across creating a vibrant one of the things up there was create a vibrant commercial district. Well, part of that's having a pedestrian-friendly series of commercial storefronts. And so
Right.
How do you do that? There's a lot that went into that. It wasn't just like, well, this is our idea and, you didn't like it, so we're not going to change it. I don't think it's that. I think there was a lot that went into that, and to unwind that just because it says up there on the screen, we don't think there should be a distinction between secondary and primary. That doesn't make any sense. There's more to it than that.
I agree with you entirely, and I think that beyond just us coming up with that, that was something that was discussed as part of the general plan update, and all those things go together.
Yep.
And so, and
Isn't there a meeting where we fill out the entire room?
Yeah, I
with-
was gonna
with
ask about
both of
that.
us?
Can't we do a joint meeting?
Can we do a joint meeting so that we can get some, so that
Policy
we're
direction.
allowed to ask questions and address those questions and get direct feedback so that we can more effectively get the council what they're looking for?
We could certainly ask city council if they would like to do that.
yeah, and maybe that's the right way to do it.
I think that, I would be more comfortable with it, because we could burn, and we don't have a lot of extra days and extra hours, and we could burn a lot of hours going through this and have it come to a dead end. Because they'll say, well, that's not what we were looking for. And it's not that we don't want to be
We just want
objectionable.
Well, yeah, and
But-
and the other thing is, I think that maybe along the way someone said, why are we doing the storefront thing? But they didn't understand all the stuff, all the reasons that, you've went into. And once you explain that, they go, oh, now I see. Okay, let's move on. Let's do the storefront thing. And so I don't get the feeling that the deliberation on the council level was detailed enough to really even, consider those ideas, because it was really just a general policy level stuff. And like I said, my take didn't have from it wasn't anything to do with the storefront. So maybe somebody else memory of that is different, but it doesn't seem like that was like discussed fully and thought about and said, no, this is not the way we want to go.
So, if we're able to get something where we have a joint sort of discussion session, I think it would be really important to have sort of I think it needs to be high level. I mean, the weed stuff, definitions, that can all be worked out, but I think those 5 or 6 points, but there needs to be a roadmap on the discussion of, we either march through that at a high level, and then we have sort of like, not a presentation, but what our thinking was when we developed these concepts
Mm-hmm.
as a subcommittee, as an entire commission, and then what are your thoughts, or how do we,
Tell us how to fit that into what you're looking for.
yeah, or does that fit what you're saying? Because here you're saying you want a vibrant downtown. Well, part of this was a component of that.
Right.
Versus when you say don't have that, you're contradicting the very notion of creating a more, visible, transparent, vibrant, pedestrian-friendly
Right.
downtown.
And I feel like if, instead of having that sort of general policy discussion that we had at the council, what was that, more than a year ago, or I don't know how many months ago, if we would have had the council just review the code amendments that we sent up, we would have gotten a lot better feedback. Because that we could have explained why we made the choices that we did to implement the main goals. And I think that it's possible that maybe some of those concepts were saying, oh, I don't want that, because they didn't understand the background and the reasoning and how those concepts work together.
So should we take this opportunity to present that, or how? Because I don't want it to be a thing where there's 15, 20 people here and no one's really saying what they really want to say, and it's just kind of like, okay, well, you should do this, or I mean, like, I want it to be fruitful, and I want it to be honest, and I want it to be direct if it needs to be, but I just want, like, we want you to do this because of X, Y, and Z, or we did this because this is what we were thinking about, like,
Well, yeah, I mean, I think
what's
that
the best way to
if
do that?
we should reconcile what we've been given to do and say, here is how we had addressed this in our draft, but then this feedback kind of directly contradicts that. Which of those two is it that you want? and just give the explanation. The reason we included, the prime directive is vibrant storefront, right? And we created this concept of the prime storefront to address that specifically. And then we were given it was suggested that we take it out. How would you
Reconcile it.
how would you reconcile that and get us the guidance? Do you want us to recommend a way to have the vibrant storefront, or do you want us to take out? And if you want us to take out, tell us why, so that we can come up with a different solution as to what the vibrant storefront is going to be.
Mm-hmm.
And just try to,
Yeah.
if we go into the code itself, I think we're going to lose a bunch
Yeah,
of
I
people.
don't think it
But if
needs to
this
be
is the
in
direction we've been given, let's try to reconcile these points and get the guidance on those.
Yeah, it has to be high level. Maybe that's a good suggestion. Somehow
We want the policy.
yeah,
Yeah.
it should revolve around
We
that.
want the market to dictate,
Yeah.
but then there's specific lists that are being requested as well. We had designed this to get it up so that as things change over time, 2 years ago vaping wasn't a concern, now it is. That would have been a simple addition for the director's list
Versus baking it into
versus
the
having to bake it into the code.
Right.
That's the logic of why we did that. Is that amenable to you? And if not, what would you like to see? I think we're really gonna spend some time, chew up time if
And-
we don't get that level.
So
of-
how
And we're gonna need to do a presentation for them as to why we built it the way we did.
Yeah.
And that may not have happened at the subcommittee level. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it did not. That makes sense.
So, we can, our time, some of our time is valuable. And the other thing is, though, I believe that staff has given us their best shot at what would be successful with the council, and so we shouldn't ignore that.
Yeah.
I think we have a hint here at what they want, but I think there's some emotional attachment to what we did all the way back for 2 or 3 years before that.
Right, but I think that we need to defend the reasons why we did certain things and why we think, but I think we need to be careful not to go to the emotional attachment. And that's what I was trying to get at before. It doesn't matter if we spend a lot of time on it, just because we spend a lot of
Yeah,
time.
I don't care about
It's not our baby.
No.
It's what we think is the right thing to implement the general plan.
Yeah,
And that's what matters, not that we
Yes.
toiled away or whatever.
Yeah.
And so if we toil away and come up with something that can be improved, it should be improved.
Sure.
And so I just want to make that clear.
I think it's just we should decouple those two things. But I think there's a lot that went into it from a brain power standpoint on why some of these ideas were developed. And if they still may not be the best solution, that's
Right.
fine.
Right.
But it's not as simple as just like remove that, we don't like it, because maybe that whole backstory wasn't presented. I don't know.
Mhm.
So I think that definitely needs to be a part of it, if we can.
I would like to hear them give us directions as, well, let the market decide, because I think we can, there's some businesses that are easier to open up and quicker to get going than others, and I don't think that those, a preponderance of them, or an abundance of them, is what they have envisioned for the city of Sierra Madre.
Yeah.
I think they would like to see something, if you look over in Monrovia, it's a vibrant downtown area, there's a variety of shops, but there's people walking in and out, and there's, one of everything. So, I don't know. And I think that's what we had envisioned with the general plan, too.
So what's the next step forward? Do we need to devise that, sort of that Q&A thing,
Well, I think
or
we
the
should find out if they'll
presentation,
accept
or?
our
Oh,
Request.
Yeah, I think I think there's two things we can do tonight. One is put that concept out there and see if that's you run it up the flagpole, up the chain of command, whatever euphemism you want to use, and see what the council directs us to do. The other thing is we do have some staff comments here, and we could give feedback on those to the extent we feel we're ready to. I've at least reviewed them at some a cursory level, and there's some things that I think, some comments that I have that might be helpful to staff as they go forward. And I don't know if other people want to do that or not.
I mean, we can start. I don't know how.
I mean, I don't know that we need to get line by line. I just, I've got a list of like five or six issues here that I sort of wanted to point out. So I mean, let me just list these then, and there's sort of more at a higher level. One thing that happened is we changed the name of a minor CUP to administrative CUP. And I don't understand why we did that, because we've had minor CUPs for umpteen years, and that's very common. But if for some reason we think administrative CUP is the right way to go, fine, but we can't just change it in the section that has the CUP, because all the res code and all the other codes call out minor CUP. So to me, it's easier just to leave it as minor CUP, but if we want to change it, we got to change it everywhere. The list, I think one of the most troubling things to me is the fact that we can't compare the lists. The chart and the list, there's not a red line so you can see where the changes are. So I didn't really dig into this in detail to understand, but number one, I think the idea of taking out the differentiation by storefront is, as we've discussed, a mistake. I also think that we had terms of heightened review, and it's been changed with commission review, but there's things that are commission review that can be approved by administrative level, by staff at administrative level. That seems like it doesn't work to me. And there were also some uses on the director's list that were changed, and, I'm fine with that, but I think we should have a red line so we can see which ones we've taken out and which ones we added, so we are all clear on that. The biggest change on this thing that I caught was that residential uses all require CUP. I never heard any discussion of that. And one of the big things we had to do for our housing element was to allow SROs. We might run afoul of HCD by requiring this. And the other thing is, now that we're separating design from use regulation, what reason do we have to require CUP for residential? It's an allowed use. I mean, before we had a CUP for all developments, and it was really because we wanted to do effectively design review for new construction, right? And so if you're
But
building.
the law changed about design review.
Right, but we can still do it on commercial, right? So if you're doing a mixed-use building, a new building, and we want to review it, that makes sense. But if you're, if it's just the residential use, if you're putting a residential use in an existing building, why do we need to review that? That seems bizarre to me. Also, because we're not regulating storefront, you can now put residential uses in the storefront, which is totally contrary to the general plan, whether there's a CUP or not. So, I mean, for that reason, we have to have at least some level of storefront review. In 1736-030, I didn't really understand the change, and because it seemed like I wasn't clear if we were just trying to change the threshold levels at which we do review, but it also seemed like we were sort of going back to the concept of we do some design review based on a CUP, which was contrary to the whole concept of regulating use and design for new construction separately. And the idea of doing doing design review on tenant improvement doesn't make sense to me. I mean, I think, I thought we baked in a concept, and it's been a long time, but I thought we baked in a concept of maybe some sort of review based on the facade change, which, you see that makes sense. But internal TIs,
Well, I mean,
we shouldn't have.
we had one instance where, like for example, I think it was the dance
Mhm.
studio, where it was good to see what they were proposing, only because they had proposed putting a solid wall behind the storefront 5 feet in,
Mm-hmm.
and it
we
would
asked
have
them to-
effectively.
We asked them to cut it in half so they
Well,
could
we
see.
asked to put some sort of transparency or windows, which they did. Could have been more, but basically the idea was that would have just been a TI, like beyond the storefront glass. You could do anything you want. You could effectively put a wall, and you would never see, you'd never see it.
Right.
So that would be bad.
And so,
So that's the
maybe the concept there is like is to tweak the language of the exterior facade changes or things
maybe
that
it's in
you
the
can
primary
you see the
storefront.
storefront or something like that, as opposed to just TIs based on square footage.
Yeah.
So, and then the those are sort of my the other sort of higher level thing is that the idea of Montecito not being included is that there was a specific exchange at the city council meeting where Councilmember Goss thought, well, maybe we should just start with Montecito because it's smaller and do that first and then come to the commercial code. And there was discussion about that, said, we've already done the commercial code, so let's just do that first and then go to Montecito. It wasn't that we didn't want to modify Montecito at all. And the changes that we proposed as a commission to the Montecito were only the changes necessary to make these work together, because the commercial uses are all allowed in the manufacturing zone. And so all they were was tying, except we took out rabbit slaughtering as a permitted use. And, I don't know if somebody is the secret way of allowing the bunny slaughtering. And I'm happy to put back in bunny slaughtering if that's the holdup. But fundamentally, it was just to get those two codes to mesh, and so that they work together. It wasn't to try to do a Montecito revision. So to me, it seems like we have to do that minimum bit when we update the commercial code.
It's basically just cross-reference.
Yeah, it's cross-referencing, and there's this one provision about a sort of like a gatekeeper's house that doesn't mesh with the residential uses in the C zone, and so that was cleaned up, and that's all. And so it seems crazy to me not to do that when that could clean up a lot of hassle, because you're going to make Montecito even less.
So excluding
Functional.
it makes no sense.
Yeah,
We're not-
excluding it entirely. It's just we're not redoing the whole zoning there. We're just fixing the cross-referencing so it works together. And that was all we proposed. And I don't remember which exhibit this was. But.
Members of the council have not served on this commission. And sometimes they don't see the forest through the trees. And it may be, we rely on staff to present the overview from 10,000 feet of why things are changing. But at some point in time, it may be more helpful when we send something up to have, this is why we did this explanation. I mean, because sometimes I think they look through and find one thing and focus on that.
Well, and I think that we've seen that in some of the code revisions. And when we presented the code and then we went to the meetings and they said, well, why did you do this one thing? And we said, oh, we did that one thing because bump up and explained. And a lot of times they said, oh, now that I understand, that makes sense. Or they said, yeah, no, I still don't like it. And we would modify it. But at least they would understand how it fit together and the purpose of it.
In the old days, we had a member of the council sitting in here so that hopefully we had somebody to explain our process.
Mm-hmm.
But I think those days are gone.
Well, when I was on the UUT committee, somebody would go and present the final report so that if there were any questions, the committee member was there to present. So it seems like that would be, rather than solely a staff presentation from the staff level and all those kind of ministerial concerns that need to be addressed, that a member or two of the commission could be there.
Normally, we pick a couple people to,
That's-
we've done that.
That's exactly what we've done, yeah. And again, I think part of the issue is that the actual code that we proposed
Never got up there.
never got to the council.
So what's your pleasure?
Well, I think we've given staff direction to go find us more direction. And we've sort of presented some feedback. I don't know if other people have other feedback they want to chime in on.
Well, I mean, on just this level, this information before us, I think I heard you say it would be right off the bat beneficial if these were just like combined.
Yeah, I mean,
Because then we're looking at one thing with staffs.
I don't think I would take that approach.
No?
It get very, very confusing. Even that version 8 with the different colors is because it's different. And
Oh.
I don't have the Word document for that, so that's your PDF.
Oh.
So otherwise, it would have to be retyped and edited that way.
well, I think in some ways, you know, I mean, like you were saying about the tables, you can't really redline them. I don't want to be a stickler for like, I must have this precisely redlined. I just want to understand, these are the changes we made, and this is why we did it.
Mm.
And so, it's like, if we can't redline a table, you can say, well, this is how the table changed. And so, like, I didn't catch the CUP for the residential until, like, my third time through this. And I was like, wait a minute, that doesn't seem to make sense to me. And, you know, but if there's an overriding reason why we want to do CUPs for residential, let's.
That's probably an error.
And if it's just an error, and then, you know, I'd hate to recommend code that goes up with something that, you know, that could have that kind of, I think, far-reaching impact. Yeah, so.
So what I'm hearing is we're gonna, I will go back to city manager, city council to get direction for a joint study session so we can have a dialogue about many of the things that we discussed, including the original reasoning and the background around your original submittal to the commission or a council that never made it to public hearing.
And we would like the opportunity to present to them, this is why we did it, and we would like to hear the policy directive that says, go here, but don't go here.
Right.
And all we need to know is what the policy is, and we've created a lot of stuff here, we can do that again. But some of the things that you said yes and no to, or that the PowerPoint said yes and no to, does cause some head scratching.
And I.
You could always look at the version we sent too, and then give us direct feedback on that. Should we give that as a third option?
That's what I would suggest that we do is, as part of the discussion, they would have that. And the commission chair probably would outline what that entails, what the background is, and why it was done, that it's on par with the general plan.
Well, the other thing is, you know, I've actually sat down with a couple of council members and sort of walked them through to understand the concepts, and I didn't hear that we don't like this or this is wrong. And I'm happy to sit down with, you know, offline to go through each and every line, and I'm sure you all have council members that you know better than I do who you could talk to. And so it doesn't only have to be in the public hearing. Obviously, we can't have a serial meeting where you meet with more than a quorum, and I'm not advocating that. Council. I'm saying talking to one or two council members, that's it. But, you know, sometimes it's helpful to do that, go line by line and understand exactly how it goes. And so, you know, that's also a vehicle that if any council members want to take any of us up on, they could.
And I can tell you from LA Unified School District that if you wanted something passed by the school board, you met with each member of the board separately to answer any and all questions, so that when it came before the board as a whole, there was nothing that came out of left field that said, well, you forgot whatever. In other words, the questions were resolved before the meeting as opposed to the process of the meeting. And you know, it's hard to do that with when everyone's a volunteer, as in Sierra Madre, but it may be in this complex a document what we may want to do. And I'd be happy to, you know, be part of that with you so that, you know, do you have any questions? Are these things, you know, and if you do them one at a time, I think, may be able to put concerns at rest.
Yep.
That's a different concept than us meeting all together.
No, we still need to meet all together because I think the public needs to see that, and we need to have that discussion. But as these meetings go, our last commission meeting seemed to go one way, and at the end it went another. And so, you know, having the ability to answer people's questions as specifically and without a lot of pressure, I think is beneficial.
Yeah, I think there's also a different function of giving background and understanding versus setting policy, and coming to the meeting understanding what's in the thing and how it works is a good thing, but the policy should be set at an open public meeting.
Absolutely.
And so I'm not trying to say we should have secret meetings or anything like that. I'm just trying to say that if we
No.
want to have understanding and discuss, if some of the concepts get convoluted, you know, we can talk about that offline. But yeah, I do think a joint meeting or a city council meeting where we can present, if they don't want to do a joint meeting, that would be really helpful. And I think that you know, I think one bit of information or policy directive that did come from all this that I thought was really helpful is that go do the parking. And you know, our thought before was, oh, we don't want to touch the parking because we don't know if the politics are right for that, and I don't know that our charge really necessarily involved that. And when the council said, you know, do the parking because they really go together, I think that was really good, and I think they do, and so it made sense. And so you can see there was a whole bunch of part that was in the commercial code that we moved over to parking, which really belongs there, and you know, we can take out of the proposed code because we don't need to duplicate it. So you know, I guess I'm just trying to give an example of where I think policy feedback can be really beneficial and helpful, and so I think the process can work. It just seems like we went into a year and a half of the dark ages for some reason. Okay.
Yeah.
Anybody want to add anything
I
more?
like the idea of briefing each of the council members individually ahead of time. I hesitated to say that because I don't have enough of a background to do it myself, so I'm going to be asking like you guys to do the work.
Well, for that matter, you know, I guess we can't meet with other commissioners individually. That would be a Brown Act, right? Violation. I was just going to say we could bring you up to speed, but that's not.
I can,
apply.
you know, dive into it deeper and get up to speed.
Two commissioners could speak. That wouldn't be a Brown Act violation. The majority can't speak.
Right.
So if two commissioners, if Commissioner Dennison and Chair Hutt wanted to inform Commissioner Dowse, that's fine.
Well, I mean, I'd be happy to meet offline when you talk about it, as long as we keep the numbers within the right thoughts. And
I've got a question. If you were going to meet with a council person anyway, I could just be a fly on the wall as you explained it? Or?
well, I mean, if a quorum of the planning commission met with a council member, we'd be violating the Brown Act because we'd have effectively a planning commission meeting, and we
Yeah.
can't do that without publicly noticing. So the concern you have with any of these kind of communications is a serial meeting where you meet with one person and then you meet with another and you tell the one that you had the first meeting with
What the second one?
what the second, or you tell the second one what the first one said, right?
Oh.
And so you could potentially meet with everyone on a government body and not violate the Brown Act. It's just you have to be really, really careful. So I think it's just safer, just meet with less than a quorum, because then you don't have any worries or issues. Okay. Let's move on to planning commission reports. Any planning
I
commission
have a
reports?
2-hour presentation.
Yeah.
I thought you were serious for a tiny second. Okay. Hearing none, we will move to the staff reports.
But I have one question for staff. Since the moratorium on water meters has been lifted, does the staff have any indication of built-up demand that we can expect?
There's been a number of residents and developers that have been waiting for the water meter moratorium to be lifted, yes. So I would imagine Stone House will be one that will be coming up pretty soon.
Oh, because they don't have meters.
They don't have,
Unlike
they have
Stone
2
Gate.
meters.
Oh, okay.
Okay, because when that was lifted, my first thought was, well, we're gonna be busy,
Mhm. That's what we're anticipating.
okay?
And is it-
total lots in town that,
Well, there's a number of lots that people may want to split. I'm thinking of a couple that couple neighbors want to join together, do a couple of lot splits. Another one could be, some of them will be considered then a parcel map because of the number of lots that they would create.
Mm-hmm.
So just with those, we're looking at 6 with Stonehouse, 12 plus. And then we have these, remember there's 2 different ownerships on the Stonehouse properties that we're calling Stonehouse. We've had interest because the other one with the 86-acre parcel is for sale now. So that one is, people are looking at, most of that's category slope 4, so it's not buildable. Most likely that would be a dedication of open space to the city for those very large, or that larger portion of that lot that's not really buildable.
And the, is that covered by the settlement agreement?
That one is covered by the settlement agreement.
So if we did any updates to the hillside ordinance, it wouldn't affect that?
Yeah.
Okay.
so I'm just unaware of this because we've had the moratorium. We have to approve new water positions, new water meters?
We will once the ordinance becomes effective. They're going for second reading at the next council meeting, then 30 days thereafter it'll be effective. People are waiting for, so they can pull or get a water meter.
So water meters come before planning
Oh,
commission?
No, it won't come before us, but once the city council says
You can have one.
you can have a water meter, all the people that have been waiting to build because they couldn't get a water meter, so these will be new buildings, new structures, or new created lots.
So only the ones that exceed the current standards by right building would come before us?
That's
Right.
right. Or,
Yeah.
or subdivisions.
Or subdivisions.
Actually, subdivisions come through us and go up to the city council.
Yeah,
Okay,
where they want to split a lot.
okay. So subdivisions come through here, new water meters don't. If somebody is all the regular
Right, if they're gonna build
two-story,
a,
over 3,500.
right,
Yeah.
they're gonna build a,
Okay.
yeah.
So they could build 10, and if none of them, it is possible that none of them would come before us.
Possible.
It is.
While we're having this discussion, Vincent, it just came to my mind. We should probably clarify for me, Public Works, that what they can and can't charge in terms of connection and capacity charges for the water connection. We do sewer as well, I think, right?
Right.
For both water and sewer, we should clarify for Public Works maybe what, because they can't charge for everything, for every type of ADU. For example, conversions, they can't charge connection or capacity charges for, but new construction, if there's an ADU being constructed on a lot for new construction, they definitely can.
Which is the public facility fee for new construction,
Yeah.
which is what council removed for ADUs.
Oh, did
They did.
Do we, we'll talk about it separately.
Now you can build ADUs with your new.
Yeah, you can build ADU with your new building?
You can.
ADU.
But those all have the same meter, so water meter doesn't make any difference on that. Okay, yeah, other staff reports?
So at our next meeting, we have 1 Nathaniel Terrace, which was Lot 9, the corner of Nathaniel Terrace and Baldwin Court. That's coming back
Oh, yeah, I remember
for a
that.
second review before the commission. We have another project. It's a demolition of an existing house, replacement structure with a 2-story house. So that's just a design review permit. And then we'll have the second half of the SB 330 legislative update.
Okay.
With some clarification.
With some clarification. To the extent it makes sense.
To an extent it makes
So no
sense.
clarification.
Are there appeals for these, for 330 that are going through the courts or anything? Is there any of this stuff on hold because of some municipality said, no, you can't do that, and we're gonna appeal?
For SB 330, I'm not aware. I do know that for the ADUs, there's litigation, but not for SB 330. Perhaps there is. I'm not aware.
So,
But it doesn't hold up, it's not holding up the law.
No. There's no injunction in place to suspend the enforcement of the law.
I almost expected that, but, okay, that there would be some kind of injunction, because it's pretty big.
Well, it'll produce quite a bit of litigation
Yeah.
from housing rights advocates and whatnot.
That's what we're most afraid of, is because because the law has some ambiguity, and because it can be interpreted differently, we're really afraid that I think housing advocates are going to come after cities, and if HCD doesn't provide us with direction, it's going to be a fight in court, as opposed to, us
Administrative
having it
direction.
figured out beforehand without going to court. So this question you posed, if I can't find the answer to it, I'm going to ask HCD. We'll see.
All right.
Little tiny houses, little tiny old houses.
Okay. Well, with that, we will adjourn until February 20th.